Hello Guy, welcome back to my new channel. When we cast our minds back to the ancient land of Egypt, our thoughts are often captured by the glitter of gold. We see the lustrous death mask of Tutankhamun, the gilded coffins of the pharaohs, and the imagined treasure troves hidden deep within the pyramids. Gold was the skin of the gods, a symbol of eternity and power. Yet the true lifeblood of this enduring civilization, the very foundation upon which its pyramids, temples, and society were built, was not a precious metal. It was found in the mud of the riverbank, the reeds swaying in the marshes, and the ubiquitous stones of the desert. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our journey begins not in a tomb or a temple, but in the marshy wetlands flanking the life-giving Nile. Here, amidst the chorus of unseen insects and the gentle lapping of water, grew a forest of slender green stalks crowned with feathery umbels that danced in the breeze. This was Cyprus papyrus, a plant so integral to the Egyptian way of life that it became a symbol for Lower Egypt itself. To the untrained eye, it is a simple reed, one of many flourishing in the fertile delta, but to the ancient Egyptians, this plant was a gift of the river god Hapi. It was the raw material for an invention that would change not only their world, but the course of human history. This was the birthplace of paper. Long before the codex, long before the printing press, the written word found its first flexible, portable, and accessible home on a sheet of papyrus. The story of this humble reed is the story of how a civilization learned to record its thoughts, manage its empire, and transmit its culture across millennia. It is the story of how knowledge itself was given a physical form, light enough to be carried, yet strong enough to outlast stone. The creation of a papyrus sheet was a marvel of ancient ingenuity, a process that transformed a waterlogged plant into a pristine surface for the scribe's brush. The task began with the harvest. Teams of workers would wade into the shallows, their feet sinking into the cool, dark mud. They selected stalks that were mature, thick and tall, some reaching up to 15 feet in height. Using small curved blades, they would cut the stems close to the root, bundling the heavy water-filled reeds onto small skiffs. It was arduous work under the hot African sun, surrounded by the ever-present dangers of the marsh, from crocodiles lurking beneath the surface to the myriad of biting insects. Once harvested, the stalks were transported to workshops, often located nearby to prevent the reeds from drying out. Here, the outer green rind, tough and fibrous, was carefully peeled away. This outer layer was not discarded. In the resource-conscious world of ancient Egypt, nothing was truly waste. It was woven into ropes, baskets, sandals, and even small boats. The true prize, however, lay within the pith. This was the core of the plant, a creamy white, cellular structure, rich with water and natural starches. This pith was the key. It was sliced into thin, translucent strips, as wide as possible. The skill of the papyrus maker was immediately apparent in the uniformity and thinness of these strips. Once a sufficient number were cut, they were laid out upon a wet surface, a wooden plank or a flat stone, often moistened with Nile water. The first layer was arranged vertically, each strip slightly overlapping its neighbor. The natural sugary sap of the pith acted as a bonding agent, a subtle glue activated by moisture and pressure. Then, a second layer was placed on top, this time with the strips arranged horizontally, creating a cross-hatched grain. This perpendicular arrangement was crucial, for it gave the finished sheet its characteristic strength and flexibility, preventing it from splitting along a single grain line. At this stage, the nascent sheet was little more than a delicate, wet lattice of plant matter. It was then covered with a cloth, perhaps linen, to absorb excess water and protect the surface. The real transformation came next. The entire assembly was placed under immense pressure, either by being hammered with a wooden mallet or pressed between two heavy stones. This process had a dual purpose. It squeezed out the remaining water, and it fused the two layers of pith together, melding them into a single cohesive sheet. The hammering also served to thin the sheet and smooth its surface, preparing it for its ultimate purpose. Finally, the pressed sheets were left to dry in the sun, their color lightening from a watery white to a pale, creamy yellow. The result was a lightweight, durable, and remarkably smooth surface, ready for the scribe. Once dried, the individual sheets, known as collimata, were often not sold alone. Scribes and administrators required longer documents, so these sheets were joined together to form scrolls. Using a simple starch-based paste, workshop artisans would glue the sheets edge to edge, with a slight overlap to ensure a strong bond. The convention was to have the horizontal fibers on the inside of the scroll, the recto, as this provided the smoothest surface for writing and was less prone to cracking when rolled. The vertical fibers remained on the outside, the verso. A standard scroll might consist of 20 sheets, creating a document many feet in length, but scrolls of enormous size could be created for important religious or administrative texts. The Great Harris Papyrus, for instance, a record of temple donations from the reign of Ramesses III, is a staggering 135 feet long. The edges of the scroll would be trimmed for neatness, and sometimes a wooden roller, an umbilicus, would be attached to one or both ends to make handling easier and to protect the papyrus from fraying. These workshops, from the smallest local operation to the grand, state-sponsored scriptoria, were the engines of a silent revolution. They turned a common marsh plant into the most important commodity for the administration of the state and the preservation of its culture. The price of a scroll would vary depending on its quality. The finest papyrus, made from the widest central parts of the pith, was a pale, almost white color with few imperfections. Lower grades, made from narrower strips or showing more discoloration, were cheaper and used for more mundane, everyday documents. The impact of papyrus on the Egyptian state cannot be overstated. Gold and grain might have funded the empire, but papyrus is what allowed it to function. The sprawling bureaucracy of the pharaohs, with its complex system of taxation, resource management, and labor organization, was entirely dependent on written records. Imagine a tax collector in a remote village in Upper Egypt. He would record the farmer's yield on a small sheet of papyrus, an ostracon of pottery, or a wax tablet. This data would then be transferred to a larger ledger, a papyrus scroll that would be sent downriver to a regional administrative center. There, scribes would compile the information from hundreds of such reports, creating a comprehensive overview of the entire district's agricultural output. These regional summaries would in turn be sent to the capital, perhaps Memphis or Thebes, where the vizier's office would consolidate them into a grand national budget. This river of information, all flowing on currents of papyrus, allowed the central government to know, with a remarkable degree of accuracy, how much grain was in its silos, how many cattle were in its herds, and how many workers could be conscripted for a new temple project. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a massive, interconnected database. Without papyrus, this level of detailed, centralized control would have been impossible. An order from the pharaoh, written on a scroll, could be carried by a messenger to the furthest Nubian outpost, ensuring the king's will was known and enacted hundreds of miles away. Legal contracts, from marriage agreements to land sales, were recorded on papyrus, providing a stable, verifiable record that gave structure and predictability to society. The law was no longer just a matter of memory and oral tradition. It was codified, written down, and archived. This created a more complex and stable legal framework, one that could handle disputes with a level of nuance that oral societies could never match. The army, too, relied on papyrus. Inventories of weapons, lists of soldiers, payment records, and campaign reports were all meticulously kept. A general on campaign could send back detailed intelligence, requests for reinforcements, or reports of victory, all thanks to this light and portable medium. Papyrus, in essence, was the nervous system of the Egyptian state, transmitting information and commands with an efficiency that was unrivaled in the ancient world. Beyond the machinery of state, papyrus was the vessel for Egypt's soul. It was on these fragile sheets that their entire culture, their religion, their literature, their science, and their very conception of the afterlife was given voice and permanence. The most sacred texts, the rituals that ensured the rising of the sun and the flooding of the Nile, were copied by priestly scribes onto scrolls that were stored in temple libraries, known as the Houses of Life. These were not just archives, they were centers of learning and magical power, where the words themselves were believed to have creative force. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions to guide the deceased through the treacherous underworld, was a common funerary text. A family would purchase a copy, often with a space left blank for the name of the deceased to be filled in. The quality of the scroll and its illustrations was a marker of status, but the essential function was the same: to provide the soul with the knowledge needed to achieve eternal life. To die without a copy was to face the terrors of the afterlife unprepared. Therefore, the papyrus scroll was not just a book, it was a vital piece of funerary equipment, as essential as the coffin or the mummification itself. This created a massive market for these scrolls, supporting a whole industry of scribes and artists who specialized in their production. Literature also flourished on the banks of the Nile, and our knowledge of it is owed almost entirely to the survival of papyrus. Great stories like the tale of Sinuhe, an epic poem about an Egyptian official who flees into exile and his eventual return, were copied and recopied for centuries, becoming classics of their time. It is a story of adventure, longing, and Egyptian identity, and it survives today because a scribe, thousands of years ago, dipped his brush in ink and set it down on a papyrus roll. We have love poems, lamentations, and wisdom texts, which offer moral instruction in the form of a father advising his son. These texts give us an intimate glimpse into the minds of the ancient Egyptians, their hopes, their fears, and their values. They are not just historical artifacts, they are windows into the human condition, preserved by the same plant that recorded tax receipts and temple inventories. The medical knowledge of Egypt, renowned throughout the ancient world, was also recorded on papyrus. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, for instance, is a detailed surgical treatise describing 48 cases of traumatic injury, from skull fractures to spinal injuries. It lays out a systematic approach to diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment, showing a level of empirical and rational medical thought that is truly astonishing for its time. It describes surgical procedures, such as setting broken bones and stitching wounds, and it does so with a clarity and precision made possible by the written word. Another text, the Ebers Papyrus, is a vast compendium of medical knowledge, listing hundreds of remedies and magical incantations for a wide range of ailments. It is a mixture of what we would call science and magic, but it demonstrates a sophisticated effort to classify diseases and develop treatments. Without papyrus, this precious knowledge would have been lost, transmitted only imperfectly through generations of oral tradition. Instead, it was written down, studied, and expanded upon, forming the basis of medical education for centuries. The profession of the scribe was one of the most respected in ancient Egypt, a pathway to power and influence. It was a career open to men from humble backgrounds, offering a rare opportunity for social mobility. The training was long and arduous. Beginning at a young age, boys would be sent to a temple school or apprenticed to a working scribe. Their education began with the basics, learning to read and write the complex hieroglyphic script with its thousands of characters. But a scribe's education went far beyond mere literacy. They had to master mathematics, accounting, law, and geography. Their training materials were often not pristine papyrus scrolls, which were too expensive for students. Instead, they practiced on cheaper materials, flakes of limestone or broken pieces of pottery known as ostraca. These were the notepads and chalkboards of ancient Egypt. Students would copy out classic texts, practice mathematical problems, and compose letters, their work corrected by a master scribe. The endless hours of practice were famously tedious, and texts from the period are full of complaints from lazy students and exhortations from their teachers. One such text, the Satire of the Trades, hilariously denigrates all other professions while praising the life of the scribe. The blacksmith, it says, has fingers like a crocodile's claws, the barber works until dusk to fill his belly, and the farmer's clothes are eternally stiff. But the scribe, he is the one who directs the work of everyone else. He is dressed in clean linen, he does not wield a hoe or a chisel, and he is bowed to by his inferiors. Once his training was complete, a scribe had a wide range of career options. He could enter the civil service, working his way up the ranks of a government ministry. He could join the army, managing logistics and communications. He could enter the priesthood, spending his life copying sacred texts in the quiet sanctity of a temple. Or he could work for a private estate, managing the household accounts of a wealthy nobleman. Whatever his path, the scribe's essential tool was his palette. This was typically a long, thin piece of wood with 2 indentations at one end for holding cakes of black and red ink. Black ink, made from fine carbon soot mixed with a binder like gum arabic, was used for the main body of the text. Red ink, made from ground ochre, was used for headings, keywords, or the opening lines of a new section, a practice that is the distant ancestor of our modern-day rubrication. The palette also had a slot for holding a set of brushes, which were made from the stems of a different kind of rush, Juncus maritimus. The scribe would chew the end of the rush to separate the fibers, creating a fine, delicate brush tip. To write, he would dip the brush in a water pot, touch it to the cake of ink, and then apply it to the papyrus with a steady hand. The hieratic script, a cursive form of hieroglyphs, was used for most everyday writing, as it was much faster to write than the more formal, pictorial hieroglyphs that were typically reserved for carving on monuments. The scribe's art was the bedrock of Egyptian society, and the papyrus scroll was his canvas. The importance of papyrus extended far beyond the borders of Egypt. It became one of the nation's most lucrative exports, a cultural and economic powerhouse. By the first millennium BCE, papyrus was the dominant writing material throughout the Mediterranean world. The Greeks, with their burgeoning traditions of philosophy, drama, and history, adopted it wholeheartedly. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, was filled with hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls, containing works from across the known world. The very word paper is derived from papyrus, a testament to its foundational role. The Romans, in turn, inherited the tradition from the Greeks. Their entire empire, much like Egypt's, was administered on papyrus. Letters between generals, imperial decrees, literary works by Virgil and Ovid, and the personal correspondence of Cicero were all penned on sheets of Egyptian papyrus. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, devotes a significant portion of his natural history to describing the cultivation and production of papyrus in Egypt, a clear indication of its importance to the Roman world. He even lists the different grades of papyrus available on the market, from the finest, named Augustan in honor of the emperor, down to cheaper commercial grades used for wrapping goods. This export trade brought immense wealth to Egypt. For centuries, the pharaohs and later the Ptolemaic and Roman rulers of Egypt held a virtual monopoly on the production of this essential commodity. It gave them a unique form of leverage. While other nations had their own writing materials, clay tablets in Mesopotamia, parchment made from animal skins in Pergamum, none had the combination of lightness, flexibility, and affordability that made papyrus so desirable. Clay tablets were heavy and cumbersome. Parchment was durable but incredibly expensive to produce, requiring the slaughter of many animals for a single book. Papyrus hit a sweet spot that made it the undisputed king of writing surfaces. The production centers in the Nile Delta were, in effect, the Silicon Valley of their day, creating a product that everyone needed and that only they could produce in sufficient quantity and quality. This monopoly also had a profound cultural impact. Because so much of the ancient world's knowledge was recorded on Egyptian papyrus, the survival of that knowledge was tied to the fate of the scrolls. The dry climate of Egypt itself has been a miraculous preservative, allowing thousands of papyri to survive in the desert sands. But in the more humid climates of Europe, papyrus was far more perishable. The texts that survived were those that were deemed important enough to be copied and recopied, first from papyrus to papyrus, and later onto the more durable but expensive medium of parchment, a process that began in the late Roman Empire. What we have today of classical literature is largely the result of this selective filtering process, a process that began with a simple reed growing in the Nile mud. However, the reign of papyrus was not eternal. Its decline was a slow and complex process, driven by a confluence of environmental, economic, and political factors. The plant itself, Cyprus papyrus, which once grew in vast, dense forests along the Nile, began to recede. Changes in the river's hydrology, combined with overharvesting and the draining of marshlands for agriculture, gradually reduced the wild supply. But the more significant challenge came from a rival writing material, parchment. As mentioned, parchment, made from the treated skins of sheep, goats, or calves, was far more durable than papyrus. It was also more resilient in the damp climates of Europe. A key innovation, the codex, the ancestor of the modern book, with individual pages bound together, also favored parchment. While papyrus could be used in codices, it was more brittle and prone to cracking at the spine. Parchment pages, on the other hand, could be folded and sewn together with much greater ease and durability. For centuries, parchment remained a luxury item, far too expensive to replace papyrus for everyday use. But as the Roman Empire fragmented and the great Mediterranean trade routes became less secure, the supply of papyrus to Europe became less reliable and more expensive. This spurred the production of parchment within Europe, and gradually its superior durability and suitability for the codex format began to win out, especially for important texts like the Bible. By the early medieval period, parchment had largely supplanted papyrus in Europe. In Egypt and the Arab world, papyrus continued to be used for several more centuries, but it faced a new competitor, paper. The technology for making paper from linen rags or other plant fibers was invented in China and slowly made its way west along the Silk Road. It arrived in the Islamic world in the 8th century, and a major paper-making industry was soon established in cities like Baghdad and Damascus. Paper had many of the advantages of papyrus. It was lightweight and flexible, but it could be made from a wider variety of raw materials and was ultimately cheaper to produce. By the 10th century CE, paper had largely replaced papyrus even in Egypt. The ancient workshops fell silent, the skills of the papyrus makers were forgotten, and the great reed forests of the Nile dwindled into a few isolated patches. The empire of knowledge built on the papyrus reed had finally given way to new technologies. The rediscovery of papyrus is a story of modern archaeology. For centuries, our knowledge of it came primarily from classical authors like Pliny. It was not until Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 that European scholars began to uncover the physical reality of these ancient documents. And it was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that the great papyrus rushes began. Archaeologists, digging in the sands of ancient Egyptian rubbish dumps, particularly in towns like Oxyrhynchus, uncovered hundreds of thousands of papyrus fragments. These were not, for the most part, grand literary or religious texts from temple libraries. They were the discarded paperwork of daily life, private letters, shopping lists, tax returns, legal petitions, school exercises, and forgotten plays. They were the contents of ancient waste paper baskets, and it is precisely this mundane quality that makes them so invaluable. They provide an unfiltered, ground-level view of life in the ancient world, a richness of social and economic detail that is absent from the more formal histories. We read the letter of a soldier writing home to his family, complaining about his pay. We see a young boy's fumbling attempts to copy out a line from Homer. We read a legal dispute between two neighbors over a stray donkey. Each fragment is a tiny, frozen moment of life. Taken together, this vast collection of papyri has revolutionized our understanding of ancient history, moving it beyond the grand narrative of kings and battles and into the homes and workplaces of ordinary people. It is a final, unexpected gift from the humble marsh reed, the papyrus plant which gave the ancient Egyptians the power to manage their world and preserve their culture, has now given us the ability to see their world with a clarity and intimacy that would have been unimaginable just a few generations ago. Its value, therefore, is not just in the past. It continues to speak, its whispers carrying across the millennia, telling us not of gold or power, but of the enduring everyday business of being human. The legacy of papyrus is woven into the very fabric of our modern world in ways we often fail to recognize. Every time we use the word paper, we are unconsciously paying homage to this Egyptian invention. Every time we scroll through a digital document, we are engaging in an act that is conceptually descended from the unrolling of a papyrus scroll. The idea of a library, a centralized repository of written knowledge, found its grandest ancient expression in the papyrus-filled shelves of the Library of Alexandria. The very structure of bureaucracy, with its reliance on written forms, memos, and archives, is a system that was pioneered and perfected on an industrial scale by the scribes of Egypt, all thanks to the endless supply of this versatile writing material. Even the layout of our documents, with margins, headings, and columns of text, follows conventions that were developed by scribes working on papyrus thousands of years ago. They faced the same challenges of clarity and readability that we do today, and they found solutions that were so effective that they have persisted through every subsequent technological shift, from parchment to the printing press to the pixel. So, while the physical material has been replaced, the intellectual and structural framework that it enabled remains. It is a technology that became so successful, so deeply embedded in the mechanics of civilization, that it has become invisible to us, as fundamental and as taken for granted as the air we breathe. But its origin lies in those sun-drenched marshes, in the hands of the workers who cut the reeds and the artisans who pressed their pith into the pages of history. It reminds us that the most powerful resources are often not the ones that glitter, but the ones that allow us to share, to record, and to remember. Gold may be the skin of the gods, but papyrus was the voice of humanity. From the vibrant green life of the river delta, we now journey west, into the stark and silent embrace of the Libyan desert. Here, about 60 miles northwest of modern Cairo, lies a depression in the earth, a valley carved by wind and time, known as the Wadi el Natron. To a traveller, it might seem a place of profound emptiness, a barren landscape where life clings precariously to the shores of a few bitter lakes. The water here does not teem with fish, nor does it nourish lush fields. Instead, as the fierce sun beats down, the water recedes, leaving behind a crystalline crust, a shimmering white deposit that glitters like a field of diamonds under the Egyptian sky. This substance, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate, was known to the ancients as netjerit. It is known to us as natron, and in this desolate, seemingly god-forsaken valley, the ancient Egyptians found one of their most sacred and essential resources. This salt was not for flavoring food. Its taste was harsh and alkaline. Its purpose was far more profound. This was the salt of purification, the agent of transformation, the very substance that cleansed the gods and preserved the mortal body for its journey into eternity. The story of natron is the story of how the Egyptians confronted the finality of death, and through a unique combination of chemistry and faith, sought to conquer it. It was the key ingredient in the business of the afterlife, a substance that touched everything from the most sacred temple rituals to the mundane task of washing clothes. In its crystalline structure lay the power to defy decay, to purify the defiled, and to make a mortal body worthy of becoming a vessel for the eternal soul. The name the Egyptians gave to this salt, netjerit, is itself deeply revealing. It is derived from the word netjera, their word for God or a divine being. To them, natron was, quite literally, the divine substance. Its inherent properties seemed miraculous, a manifestation of sacred power in the physical world. Its primary characteristic was its intense purity and its ability to cleanse. In a world where ritual purity was paramount, natron was the ultimate detergent. Before any important religious ceremony could begin, the temple itself had to be ritually purified. Priests would dissolve natron in water, creating a lustral solution that was then sprinkled throughout the sacred spaces. They would wash the floors, the walls, and the sacred implements with it, believing that the natron solution did not just physically clean the surfaces, but spiritually purged them of any malevolent influences or impurities. The statues of the gods themselves, believed to be living embodiments of the deities they represented, underwent a daily ritual of purification. In the quiet dawn of the temple's inner sanctum, a high priest would gently wash the divine statue with natron water, cleansing it from the impurities of the night and preparing it for the new day. This was a far more significant act than mere housekeeping. It was a cosmic renewal, ensuring that the bond between the human and divine worlds remained clean and unbroken. The priests who performed these sacred duties also had to be in a state of absolute purity. They would chew on small pellets of solid natron as a form of mouthwash, cleansing their breath so that the holy words they recited would emerge in a pure state. They bathed in natron water, their bodies and their linen garments scrubbed with the divine salt to make them worthy of entering the presence of the gods. Natron was, therefore, deeply intertwined with the very concept of the sacred. It was the earthly agent of divine order, pushing back against the forces of chaos and decay. Its discovery in the Wadi el Natron was not seen as a geological curiosity, but as a profound gift, a sign that the gods themselves had provided humanity with the tools needed to approach them. The journey of Natron from the desolate floor of the Wadi el Natron to the temples and workshops across Egypt was a testament to ancient logistical prowess. The harvesting of this resource was a seasonal affair, dictated by the rhythm of the sun and the evaporation of the lakes. In the hottest months, as the water levels dropped, vast crystalline plains of natron would be exposed along the shorelines. Teams of workers, likely under the supervision of state officials or temple authorities, would descend into the valley. The work was grueling, the desert sun was relentless, and the reflected glare from the white salt fields was blinding. The air was dry and thick with alkaline dust. The workers used simple tools, perhaps wooden rakes or stone hoes, to break up the thick crust of natron. It was then gathered into baskets, the sharp crystals cutting at their hands. The harvested salt was not uniform in quality. The purest layers, with the highest concentration of sodium carbonate, were carefully separated and reserved for the most sacred purposes, particularly the rituals of mummification and high temple ceremonies. Lower grades, mixed with more sand and other impurities, were set aside for less critical applications, such as household cleaning or industrial processes. The sheer quantity of natron required by a civilization that mummified not only its elite, but also vast numbers of its general populace, not to mention sacred animals like cats, ibises, and crocodiles, was immense. This necessitated an almost industrial scale of extraction. Once harvested and sorted, the natron had to be transported. The Wadi el Natron was isolated, connected to the fertile Nile Valley by a series of desert tracks. The journey was arduous and dangerous. The salt was loaded into sacks and slung onto the backs of endless trains of donkeys, the primary beasts of burden for overland trade. These caravans, kicking up clouds of dust, would trek for days across the unforgiving landscape, heading east towards the Nile. The route was likely dotted with wells and guarded way stations, as this was a strategic supply chain, vital to the state's religious and economic interests. The control over the natron supply was almost certainly a state or temple monopoly, a resource so critical to the ideology of divine kingship and the promise of the afterlife was too important to be left to the whims of private enterprise. Upon reaching the Nile, the natron would be loaded onto cargo barges. Here, the mighty river, the superhighway of ancient Egypt, would take over. Boats laden with the precious salt would travel up and down the river, distributing it to every corner of the kingdom. They would arrive at the docks of great cities like Memphis and Thebes, where the salt would be unloaded and taken to the storehouses of the great temple complexes and the workshops of the embalmers. The journey of a single crystal of natron, from its formation in a sun-scorched desert lake to its final use in the preservation of a pharaoh, was a microcosm of the Egyptian state's ability to identify, exploit, and distribute a key natural resource, all in the service of its most deeply held beliefs. The most famous and awe-inspiring use of natron was, without question, its central role in the art of mummification. The Egyptian belief in an afterlife was not merely a vague hope. It was a complex and detailed theology that required the physical preservation of the body. The soul, or more accurately, the different aspects of the soul, such as the ka, the life force, and the ba, the personality, needed to be able to return to the body after death to receive sustenance and continue its existence in the next world. If the body decayed, the soul would be left homeless, doomed to wander for eternity. It was therefore a religious imperative to halt the natural process of decomposition. The Egyptians became masters of this art, and dry natron was their primary tool. The entire process was a sacred and highly ritualized procedure, carried out by a specialized team of priests and technicians in a place called the wabit, the pure place, or the per-nefer, the house of beauty, a workshop typically located near the necropolis. The process began after the period of mourning. The body of the deceased was brought to the wabit. The team was led by a master embalmer, a priest known as the Hershri Seshta, or the overseer of the mystery. He was a man of immense religious knowledge and practical skill. He would often wear a jackal-headed mask representing Anubis, the god of embalming and the afterlife, who was believed to be personally overseeing the procedure. The first step was to wash the body. This was done with water from the sacred Nile, often mixed with palm wine to help cleanse the skin. This initial washing was both a practical cleansing and a ritual purification, preparing the vessel for its sacred transformation. Following the washing, the most delicate and gruesome part of the process began, the removal of the internal organs, which were the fastest to decay. The brain was the first to go. The Egyptians did not consider the brain to be the seat of intelligence or consciousness. That role was reserved for the heart. The brain was simply cranial stuffing, and its removal was treated with a workmanlike lack of ceremony. The embalmers would use a long iron hook, inserting it through the nostril and forcefully hammering it through the thin ethmoid bone at the back of the nasal cavity to enter the skull. They would then swizzle the hook around, liquefying the brain tissue. The head was then tilted, and the liquefied brain would drain out through the nose. Any remaining pieces were extracted with long, thin probes. It was a brutal but effective method of exoration. Next came the evisceration. The sambu, or cutter, would make a sharp incision on the left flank of the body. Herodotus, the Greek historian, claims this was done with a sharp piece of obsidian, or an Ethiopian stone, and that after making the cut, the cutter would run away as if having committed a crime, possibly a ritualized acknowledgement of the defilement of a human body. Through this incision, the embalmers would reach into the body cavity and manually remove the stomach, the liver, the intestines, and the lungs. Each organ was carefully extracted, washed with palm wine and spices, and set aside for its own preservation. The one major organ that was almost always left in place was the heart. The Egyptians believed the heart was the center of a person's intelligence, memory, and morality. It was in the heart that all of a person's deeds, good and bad, were recorded. In the afterlife, the deceased would face the weighing of the heart ceremony, where their heart would be weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was heavier than the feather, it was devoured by the monster Ammit, and the soul was annihilated. If it was lighter, the deceased was judged worthy and granted eternal life. To remove the heart would be to rob the deceased of their chance for judgment and immortality. The empty body cavity was then thoroughly cleaned and sterilized, rinsed with more palm wine and a cocktail of fragrant spices. Once the organs were removed, they too had to be preserved. They were not discarded. They were destined to be reunited with the body in the tomb, if not in the body itself. Each of the 4 major organs was placed in its own dedicated container, what we now call a canopic jar. These jars were not mere storage vessels. They were sacred artifacts, each protected by one of the 4 sons of the god Horus. The stomach was placed in a jar with a lid shaped like the head of the jackal god Duamutef. The intestines went into a jar protected by the falcon-headed Kibis-Inuef. The liver was guarded by the human-headed Imseti, and the lungs were placed under the protection of the baboon-headed Hapi. These jars and their precious contents would be placed in the tomb alongside the coffin. The preservation of these organs was also accomplished using natron. They would be dried and treated, sometimes wrapped in linen, before being sealed in their respective jars. With the organs removed and the body cavity cleaned, the main event of the preservation process could begin, the complete desiccation of the body using natron. The embalmers would pack the inside of the torso with temporary packets of linen stuffed with natron, or with loose natron, to begin the drying process from the inside out. Then the entire body was laid on a sloping embalming table and completely buried under a massive pile of dry natron. It was covered from head to toe, every inch of skin in contact with the powerful desiccating agent. This was the critical stage. The natron, with its unique chemical properties, immediately went to work. The sodium carbonate acted as a powerful drying agent, drawing out the water from the body's tissues through osmosis. At the same time, the sodium bicarbonate in the mixture increased the alkalinity, creating a hostile environment for the bacteria that caused decomposition. The salt content also contributed to this antibacterial action. For a period of 40 days, the body lay interred in this mountain of divine salt. This period was not arbitrary. It was symbolically linked to the time the star Sothis, or Sirius, was absent from the sky, a period of cosmic renewal. During these 40 days, the body underwent a profound transformation. It lost a significant portion of its weight as the water was wicked away. The skin tightened, the muscles shriveled, and the flesh became hard and leathery. It was a slow, controlled process of dehydration, which perfectly preserved the body's overall form while making it impervious to decay. After the 40 days were complete, the body was exhumed from its natron bed. The salt, now caked and heavy with the absorbed fluids, was carefully brushed away. The temporary packing bags were removed from the body cavity. The result was a shrunken, darkened, but perfectly preserved human form. It was now considered purified, a stable vessel for the soul. The used natron, having absorbed the fluids of a human body, was considered ritually unclean and could not be reused. It was carefully gathered and buried, often in the desert nearby, but the work was not yet finished. The desiccated body was stiff and brittle. The next phase of the process, which could take up to another 30 days, involved making the body supple and preparing it for its final wrapping. It was washed once more to remove any remaining natron residue. Then, it was anointed from head to toe with a series of expensive and fragrant oils and resins. This was done to restore some moisture and flexibility to the skin, and also to impart a pleasant, godlike scent. Resins such as myrrh and frankincense, which were imported at great expense, also had powerful antibacterial properties, adding another layer of protection. The empty body cavity was now permanently packed, sometimes with clean linen bandages soaked in resin, sometimes with sawdust, and in later periods with the preserved organs themselves, each wrapped and returned to its approximate original position. The incision on the flank was sewn up and often covered with a protective plaque, usually featuring the protective eye of Horus. The final stage was the wrapping. This was an incredibly intricate process, involving hundreds of yards of fine linen bandages. A team of bandagers would work under the direction of a lector priest, who would recite magical spells and incantations at each stage of the wrapping. The process was methodical and deeply symbolic. The arms and legs were wrapped separately, as were the individual fingers and toes. Between the layers of linen, the embalmers would place dozens of amulets, each with a specific magical purpose. A scarab beetle amulet, a symbol of rebirth, was often placed over the heart. An ankh, the symbol of life, might be placed in the hands. A jed pillar, representing stability and the backbone of the god Osiris, would grant the deceased the strength to stand in the afterlife. With each layer of linen and each placed amulet, the body was not just being covered, it was being endowed with magical protection and divine power. Finally, the fully wrapped mummy was given its iconic shape. A final shroud was placed over the body, often painted with the likeness of the deceased or the god Osiris. The mummy was then placed in its coffin, or series of nested coffins, ready for the funeral and its final journey to the tomb. This entire elaborate and expensive process, the very cornerstone of the Egyptian funerary religion for 3,000 years, was utterly dependent on the desiccating power of the salt from the Wadi el Natron, while its role in mummification was its most sacred and dramatic application. The importance of natron permeated all levels of Egyptian society. It was a common, everyday substance, the ancient equivalent of baking soda, bleach, and soap all rolled into one. In a household, natron was an indispensable cleaning agent. For personal hygiene, it was mixed with oil to create a soapy paste that could be used for washing the body. While it would have been harsh on the skin, it was an effective cleanser. It was also used as a mouthwash and dentifrice, chewed in its raw form or mixed with water to create a cleansing rinse that helped combat bad breath and oral infections. The Egyptians, with their iconic heavy makeup, also used natron. It was a component in some faience beads and was used as a solvent in the production of some cosmetics. Laundry was done with natron. Soiled linen garments, a staple of Egyptian dress, were scrubbed with the alkaline salt, which helped to break down grease and dirt, leaving the fabric clean and bright. In the kitchen, natron was used as an abrasive to scour pots and pans. It was also employed as a mild insecticide and a way to keep stored grain free from pests. It even played a role in cuisine, not as a seasoning, but as a preservative for fish and meat. Just as it dried a human body, a coating of natron could be used to salt-cure fish, creating a food source that could be stored for long periods, a vital source of protein when fresh food was scarce. Beyond the household, natron was a key industrial chemical. The Egyptians were the masters of creating faience, a vibrant blue-green glazed ceramic that was not made from clay. Faience objects, from amulets and beads to tiles and statuettes, were made from a paste of ground quartz or sand, mixed with a lime and an alkali, which was typically natron. When the object was fired, the natron acted as a flux, melting the quartz particles and forming a glassy, self-glazing surface. The brilliant blue and green colors, so reminiscent of the life-giving Nile and the eternal heavens, were achieved by adding copper compounds to the mix. The production of faience was a major industry, and it was entirely reliant on a steady supply of natron. Similarly, natron was a crucial ingredient in the manufacture of Egyptian glass. While glass-making was developed elsewhere, the Egyptians perfected it, creating stunning multicolored glass vessels, beads, and inlays. To create glass, one needs silica, sand, a stabilizer, lime, and a flux to lower the melting point of the sand. Again, natron was the flux of choice. By mixing desert sand with natron and heating it to high temperatures, Egyptian artisans could create molten glass, which could then be worked into intricate and beautiful objects. The salt from the Wadi Ale natron was therefore not just preserving the past through mummification. It was helping to create some of the most beautiful and technologically advanced artifacts of the ancient world. The medical practitioners of ancient Egypt also found numerous uses for this versatile salt. The medical papyri, such as the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, contain numerous prescriptions that call for natron as an ingredient. Its antiseptic and drying properties made it a valuable addition to wound dressings and poultices. When applied to an injury, it would have helped to clean the area, prevent infection, and promote healing by keeping the wound dry. It was prescribed for a variety of skin ailments, from rashes to fungal infections. As an oral hygiene agent, it was recommended for treating gum disease and mouth sores. It was even prescribed in solutions to be taken internally for digestive complaints and other illnesses, though the efficacy and safety of such treatments are debatable by modern standards. What is clear, however, is that Egyptian physicians recognized the powerful chemical properties of natron and attempted to harness them for therapeutic purposes. They were engaging in a form of applied chemistry, using a naturally occurring substance to fight disease and injury. Its role in medicine further underscores its perceived identity as a purifying agent, one that could combat not only ritual impurity and the decay of death, but also the decay of the living body caused by sickness. The decline in the widespread use of natron for its most famous purpose, mummification, was a gradual process, mirroring the slow transformation of Egyptian society itself. As Egypt was absorbed into the Hellenistic and later the Roman world, traditional religious practices began to change. While mummification continued, it was often done with less care and attention to the ancient rituals. The focus shifted from perfect internal preservation to the external appearance of the mummy, with more elaborate bandaging patterns and painted portraits. The painstaking 40-day desiccation in natron was sometimes shortened or done less thoroughly. The final blow came with the rise of Christianity in Egypt. The new faith brought with it a completely different conception of the body and the afterlife. Christians believed in a spiritual resurrection, not a physical one that required the preservation of the earthly body. The body was seen as a temporary vessel, and upon death it was to be committed to the earth, dust to dust. Mummification, with its deep roots in the old pagan theology of Osiris and the journey through the underworld, was seen as a superstitious and unnecessary practice. By the 4th and 5th century CE, as Christianity became the dominant religion, the ancient art of embalming, and with it the massive demand for natron, faded into history. The great workshops of the Per-Nefer fell silent. The donkey caravans from the Wadi El Natron still carried their salty burden, but it was now destined for more mundane uses, for the glassmakers, the faience factories, and the laundries. The divine salt had become a simple industrial chemical, yet the legacy of natron is as enduring as the mummies it created. It represents a profound and uniquely Egyptian intersection of faith, science, and landscape. In a desolate valley, they found a substance that answered their deepest existential fears. With it, they developed a sophisticated chemical process that allowed them to challenge the inevitability of decay. This process, in turn, reinforced and gave physical expression to their complex theology of the afterlife. Natron was the linchpin that connected the physical body to the eternal soul, but its story also reminds us that the sacred and the profane often walk hand in hand. The same salt that purified the body of a pharaoh for his meeting with the gods was also used by a commoner to scrub her cooking pots. It was a substance that was simultaneously at the heart of the most esoteric religious mysteries and an essential part of the daily grind of domestic life. This duality is what makes it such a powerful symbol of the Egyptian worldview. It demonstrates a society that did not see a hard line between the sacred and the mundane, but rather saw the divine present in the natural world, in the very salt of the earth. The glittering crystals of the Wadi el Natron were more than just sodium carbonate to the Egyptians. They were a promise that even in the face of death, there could be purity, permanence, and the hope of a new dawn. It was the humble earthly tool they used to build their bridge to eternity. If papyrus was the mind of ancient Egypt and natron its soul, then stone was its skeleton. It was the enduring framework upon which its civilization was built, the physical manifestation of its obsession with permanence. We have explored the resources that managed the empire and prepared the body for the afterlife. But now we turn to the very substance that gave that afterlife a home and gave the gods a dwelling place on earth. In the Egyptian imagination, the world was shaped by divine forces, and the stones that composed the landscape were seen as the very bones of the earth gods. To build with stone was therefore not merely construction, it was an act of participating in the divine order, of taking the most permanent material available and shaping it into a message of power, faith, and eternity. This was not a single resource but a trinity of materials, each with its own character and purpose. There was the soft, pale limestone, the canvas of the pyramid builders, the warm golden sandstone, the chosen medium of the great imperial temples, and the impossibly hard crystalline granite, the material reserved for the threshold of eternity itself. The story of stone in Egypt is a story of geology, logistics, and breathtaking ambition, a tale of how legions of ordinary men with the simplest of tools reshaped the landscape to defy the ages. Our exploration of Egypt's geological heart begins with limestone, the foundational stone of its most ancient and iconic monuments. Geologically, limestone is a gift from a vanished sea. Millions of years before the first pharaoh, Egypt was submerged beneath the warm waters of the Tethys Ocean. As countless trillions of marine organisms, foraminifera, shellfish, and corals lived and died, their calcium carbonate skeletons and shells drifted down to the seabed, accumulating in unfathomably thick layers. Over eons, the pressure of the water above and the weight of subsequent deposits compacted this organic sediment, cementing it into the soft, sedimentary rock we know as limestone. When the seas retreated and the Nile began to carve its valley, it exposed these vast, brilliant white cliffs. For the builders of the Old Kingdom, whose power was centered in the northern capital of Memphis, this was a miraculous convenience. The finest limestone quarries, such as those at Tura and Masara, were located on the eastern bank of the Nile, just a short ferry ride from the great necropolises of Saqqara, Dashur, and Giza. The stone itself was perfect for their burgeoning architectural ambitions. It was relatively soft and easy to work with the copper and stone tools of the era, yet durable enough for monumental construction. Its fine, consistent grain was ideal for carving delicate reliefs, and its pure white color was seen as a symbol of purity and sacredness. When polished, it gleamed with a blinding luminescence under the African sun, turning the great pyramids into beacons of divine light. Limestone was more than just a building material. It was the pristine page on which the Old Kingdom wrote its story. The process of extracting this stone from the earth was a triumph of human organization and relentless effort. The quarries were not haphazard pits. They were carefully planned and systematically exploited operations under state control. The quarrymen first had to clear away the looser, weathered surface rock to reach the solid, high-quality beds beneath. Once a suitable face was exposed, the work of cutting the blocks began. Using copper chisels which had to be constantly resharpened by teams of smiths, and heavy wooden mallets, the workers would painstakingly carve deep, narrow trenches or channels around the perimeter of the desired block. It was slow, arduous work, performed by teams of men crouched in the cramped, dusty trenches for hours on end. For harder grades of limestone, they might have used heavy pounders made of dolerite, a harder igneous rock. Once the channels were cut on the top and sides, the most ingenious part of the process began. The workers would carve a series of small holes along the intended fracture line at the base of the block. Into these holes they hammered dried wooden wedges. Then they poured water onto the wedges. Over several hours the wood would absorb the water and swell with immense, irresistible force, creating internal pressure that would finally crack the massive block free from the bedrock. With a great groan, a multi-ton piece of a prehistoric seabed, now a perfectly rectangular block, was born. It was then levered onto rollers and dragged from the quarry face, ready for the next stage of its journey. The scale of this operation, repeated millions of times, staggers the imagination. Nowhere is the result of this colossal effort more evident than on the Giza Plateau. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, is a man-made mountain of limestone. It is composed of an estimated 2.3 million blocks, with a total weight of nearly 6 million tons. The sheer logistics of quarrying and moving this much material within the 2-decade reign of a single pharaoh is one of history's greatest feats of project management. The builders cleverly used 2 different types of limestone. The vast majority of the pyramid, its internal core, was built from rougher, yellowish blocks, quarried directly on the Giza Plateau itself, saving immense transport effort. These core blocks were functional, not aesthetic, and were laid down in massive courses. But the true glory of the pyramid was its outer skin. For this the builders went to the elite quarries across the river at Tura. From there they brought over 144,000 casing blocks of the finest, purest white limestone. Each block was cut with breathtaking precision, angled perfectly, and dressed so smoothly that the joints between them were almost invisible. When completed, the Great Pyramid was not the tiered, sand-colored structure we see today. It was a smooth, seamless, gleaming white behemoth, its 4 faces reflecting the sunlight like a polished gem. It must have been a sight of almost supernatural power and beauty, a perfect geometric form that seemed to connect the earth with the heavens, a true stairway for the soul of the departed king. Once a block was quarried, it had to be moved, a challenge that, for the heaviest blocks, was as great as the quarrying itself. For the fine Tura limestone destined for the Giza pyramids, the journey began with a short drag from the quarry face to the banks of the Nile. There, the blocks were loaded onto immense wooden barges during the annual inundation from July to October, when the river was at its highest. The floodwaters not only made river transport possible, but also brought the water level much closer to the desert plateau, shortening the overland journey. Canals were dug from the river's main channel, leading to harbours and landing stages built right at the foot of the construction sites. But the final leg of the journey was the most demanding. The blocks, some weighing as much as 15 tons, had to be moved from the barges up the slope to the building site. This was accomplished using massive wooden sledges. The sledge was placed on a specially prepared trackway, or slipway, sometimes paved with wooden beams. To reduce the friction, which would have been immense, workers poured water or wet Nile silt onto the path just ahead of the sledge's runners. Teams of hundreds of men, their bodies straining in unison, would then haul on thick ropes of papyrus or palm fiber, dragging the colossal weight inch by inch. The famous painting from the tomb of Jehuti-Hotep, dating to the Middle Kingdom, clearly depicts this very process, showing 172 men dragging a colossal alabaster statue on a sledge, with a man in front pouring lubricant on the ground. It was a system that relied on brute force, but a highly organized and coordinated application of it. While the pyramids are the most spectacular testament to limestone, this versatile stone was central to many other aspects of Egyptian funerary art and architecture. The mastabas of the Old Kingdom nobles, the flat-topped tombs that surrounded the pyramids, were constructed from limestone blocks. It was within these tombs that the material truly came to life as a canvas. The interior walls of the chapels were covered in vast, intricate scenes of daily life, all carved in delicate low relief into the smooth limestone surfaces. These reliefs are a priceless window into their world. We see scenes of farming, feasting, hunting in the marshes, and counting cattle, all meant to magically provide for the deceased in the afterlife. The fine grain of the limestone allowed the artists to achieve an incredible level of detail, from the patterns on a nobleman's kilt to the individual feathers on a bird's wing. These carved walls were then brightly painted, making the chapels vibrant, colourful spaces. Limestone was also the preferred material for the private statues of the non-royal elite. Sculptors could work it with relative ease, creating the serene, formal figures that would act as a spare body for the deceased's car to inhabit. From the famous seated scribe in the Louvre to countless statues of husbands and wives, limestone gave a tangible personal form to the quest for individual immortality, moving beyond the monumental scale of the king and creating a more intimate connection with the eternal. As the political dynamics of Egypt shifted, so too did its choice of stone. By the time of the New Kingdom, some 1500 years before the Common Era, the center of religious and political power had moved south to the city of Thebes, modern-day Luxor. Here, the local geology was different. While limestone was available, the dominant and most accessible high-quality building stone was sandstone. Sandstone, like limestone, is a sedimentary rock, but instead of being formed from marine shells, it is composed of countless grains of sand, cemented together over millions of years by minerals like silica or calcite. This geological fact had a profound impact on the architecture of Egypt's imperial age. The sandstone quarries, most notably the colossal site of Gebel el-Silsila, were located conveniently on the banks of the Nile, right in the heart of Upper Egypt. Sandstone was generally harder and more durable than limestone, and crucially, it could often be quarried in much larger blocks. This allowed the architects of the New Kingdom pharaohs, like Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and Rameses the Great, to think on a truly megalomaniac scale. The resulting temples were not just places of worship, they were massive, awe-inspiring declarations of the empire's power and the supremacy of their patron god, Amun-Ra. The very color of the stone, a warm golden or reddish-brown, also lent a different character to these monuments, making them glow with an earthy solar fire in the intense Theban sunlight. The undisputed heart of the sandstone industry was the quarry at Gebel el-Silsila, located about 40 miles north of Aswan. This site was an architect's dream. Here the Nile Valley narrows dramatically, and the river flows directly past enormous cliffs of high-quality sandstone on both its east and west banks. This unique geography eliminated the most difficult part of the stone transportation process, the long overland drag to the river. The quarrymen could cut blocks directly from the cliff face, and with minimal effort, lower them onto barges waiting in the river below. For nearly 2,000 years, from the Middle Kingdom to the Roman period, Gebel el-Silsila was the source for nearly every major temple in Upper Egypt. The scale of the operation was staggering, leaving behind vast, echoing galleries where entire hillsides have been removed. Walking through the quarry today, you can still see the quarry marks, the clear vertical lines where individual blocks were cut away. The site is also dotted with rock-cut shrines and stelae, commemorative plaques left behind by the pharaohs and their high officials. These inscriptions record the great quarrying expeditions, ordered to acquire stone for a new pylon or hall, often listing the thousands of soldiers, laborers, and officials involved. Gebel el-Silsila was more than a quarry. It was a permanent, industrial-scale extraction site, the engine room that powered the great Theban building boom, and provided the raw material for an empire to write its legacy in stone. The architectural results of this sandstone revolution are best exemplified by the temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor. These were not single buildings, but sprawling, sacred cities of stone, added to by pharaoh after pharaoh over hundreds of years. At Karnak, the great hypostyle hall, a forest of 134 colossal sandstone columns, is one of the most breathtaking spaces ever created by humankind. The columns, designed to resemble bundles of papyrus stalks, soar to heights of nearly 70 feet, their surfaces covered in hieroglyphic inscriptions. The sheer mass of sandstone required for this hall alone is immense. It was designed to overwhelm the senses, to make any human who entered it feel small and insignificant in the presence of the gods and the king. The towering entrance pylons, the vast open-air courts, and the massive enclosure walls were all made possible by the availability of large, strong sandstone blocks from Jebel el-Silsila. These structures were the ultimate expression of imperial propaganda. They were physical manifestations of the Egyptian cosmos, with their stone floors representing the earth, and the columned ceilings, painted with golden stars, representing the sky. The warm golden hue of the sandstone itself contributed to the theology, evoking the sun, the primary manifestation of the temple's chief resident, the god Amun-Ra. These were not just buildings, they were stone models of the universe, designed to impress and intimidate all who saw them. The shift from the fine-grained limestone of the Old Kingdom to the coarser sandstone of the New Kingdom required a corresponding shift in artistic techniques. While beautiful raised reliefs were still created in sandstone, the material was particularly well suited to a different style of carving, sunken relief. In traditional raised relief, the background is cut away, leaving the figures standing out from the surface. In sunken relief, the process is reversed. The sculptor carves the outlines of the figures deep into the stone, and then models the details of the figures below the level of the main surface. This technique had several advantages for the grand, exterior walls of the Theban temples. Firstly, it was faster to produce, a significant consideration when one had to cover acres of wall space. Secondly, it was less prone to damage, as there were no projecting edges to be chipped or weathered away. But most importantly, it was an aesthetic choice that perfectly suited the environment. In the brilliant overhead sunlight of Upper Egypt, sunken reliefs create sharp, dramatic shadows along their outlines. This makes the figures and hieroglyphs stand out with remarkable clarity, even when viewed from a great distance. A massive temple pylon covered in sunken relief scenes of the pharaoh smiting his enemies became a giant, legible billboard, broadcasting a message of royal power and divine order across the landscape. The technique turned the very sunlight of Egypt into an artistic tool, using shadow as its ink. A spectacular example of the use of sandstone for monolithic sculpture can be found on the west bank of Thebes, rising silently from the green fields. These are the two massive statues known to the world as the Colossi of Memnon. Each statue, depicting the pharaoh Amenhotep III seated on a throne, is carved from a single block of quartzite, a very hard type of sandstone cemented by silica. They are 60 feet tall and weigh an estimated 720 tons each. What is most remarkable is that the stone for these statues did not come from the nearby quarries of Jebel el-Silsila. Geological analysis has shown that it was quarried at a site near modern Cairo, hundreds of miles to the north, and then transported upstream to Thebes. The feat of transporting two 700-ton monoliths this distance against the current of the Nile is almost beyond comprehension. They once stood guard before the entrance to Amenhotep III's mortuary temple, which was, at the time, the largest and most opulent religious complex in all of Egypt. While the temple itself, having been built on the floodplain, has long since vanished, its stone scavenged for later projects, its two silent guardians remain. They became famous in the Greco-Roman period for the phenomenon of the singing Memnon. The northern colossus, damaged in an earthquake in 27 BCE, would reportedly emit a high-pitched sound at sunrise, which was interpreted as the mythical hero Memnon greeting his mother Eos, the goddess of the dawn. Though the sound ceased after a Roman emperor repaired the statue, the legend cemented the colossi as timeless wonders, sandstone sentinels watching over the passage of empires. Our journey through Egypt's sacred geology now takes us to the southernmost frontier of the ancient kingdom, to the region of Aswan, at the first cataract of the Nile. Here the landscape changes dramatically. The smooth cliffs of limestone and sandstone give way to a chaotic jumble of smooth, water-worn crystalline rocks that burst through the desert floor. This is the home of granite, an igneous rock formed from the slow cooling of molten magma deep within the Earth's crust. Granite is a material of immense hardness and beauty, composed of interlocking crystals of quartz, feldspar, and mica. It comes in a variety of colors, from the iconic pink and red syenite granite to darker shades of grey and black. For the ancient Egyptians, granite was the ultimate stone. Its extreme durability made it the perfect material for objects that were meant to be truly eternal and indestructible. Its quarrying and working presented a monumental challenge, far greater than that of limestone or sandstone, and its use was therefore reserved for the most important and sacred of purposes. Sarcophagi, obelisks, the burial chambers of kings, and the statues of the most powerful gods were often crafted from this unyielding stone. To choose granite was to make a statement about ultimate permanence, to use a material that seemed not to have been made on earth, but to be a piece of the eternal cosmos itself. Working with a stone as hard as granite, without the aid of iron or steel tools, is a testament to Egyptian ingenuity and, above all, patience. The primary tool for quarrying and shaping granite was the dolerite pounder. Dolerite is an igneous rock that is even harder and more dense than granite. Quarry workers would use these handheld balls of dolerite, weighing up to 12 pounds, to slowly batter the granite surface. The process was painstakingly slow. To free a large block or an obelisk, hundreds of workers would stand side by side, relentlessly pounding a trench into the granite, chipping it away grain by grain. The sound must have been deafening, a continuous percussive roar echoing through the quarry. It is estimated that this method could wear away the granite at a rate of only a few millimeters per hour. To cut a single obelisk from the bedrock could take many months, or even years of continuous back-breaking labor. Once the trenches were deep enough, they would use the same water and wedge technique as in the limestone quarries, though on a much larger and more difficult scale. Some theories also suggest they may have used the heat of fire, followed by the shock of cold water, to help fracture the rock, though the evidence for this is less certain. What is certain is that the process relied on a colossal expenditure of time and human energy, a price the pharaohs were willing to pay for a piece of eternity. The Aswan quarry is home to one of the most remarkable artifacts of ancient engineering, the unfinished obelisk. Had it been completed, it would have been the largest single piece of stone ever quarried by the Egyptians. Standing nearly 140 feet tall and weighing an estimated 1,200 tons, it lies today where it was abandoned thousands of years ago, still attached to the bedrock on its underside. It is a monumental failure that has taught us more about Egyptian quarrying techniques than any finished monument could. Walking alongside it, you can see the massive trenches pounded out by the dolerite balls, the red ochre lines drawn by the master architect to guide the workers, and the sheer breathtaking scale of the ambition. The project was abandoned when a fatal flaw, a large crack, appeared in the granite as it was being freed from the bedrock. All the tens of thousands of man-hours invested in the project were lost in that moment. It is a silent monument to the immense risks involved in working with these natural materials. It speaks of the heartbreak of the craftsmen who had to walk away from their masterpiece, but it also speaks of their profound understanding of the stone. They knew that a flawed obelisk could never be raised. It would have shattered under its own colossal weight. The unfinished obelisk is a humbling reminder of the limits of human endeavor, even for a civilization as mighty as Egypt's. Perhaps the most elegant and symbolically potent objects carved from Aswan granite were the obelisks. These towering four-sided monoliths, tapering to a pyramid-shaped point called a pyramidion, were architectural marvels and profound religious statements. The pyramidion itself, the benden, was a solar symbol, representing the primordial mound from which the creator god had emerged. It was often sheathed in electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, or pure gold, so that it would catch the very first and last rays of the sun, sending a flash of divine light across the landscape. Obelisks were always erected in pairs, standing before the massive entrance pylons of the great temples. They were solar fingers, connecting the earthly temple of the god with the heavens where he dwelled. The feat of finishing, transporting and erecting these monolithic giants was arguably even more impressive than their quarrying. Once carved, they were dragged on enormous sledges to the Nile and loaded onto specially constructed barges. At their destination, they had to be raised to a vertical position and lowered onto a prepared base with pinpoint accuracy, a process that likely involved massive earthen ramps, ropes, and a deep sand pit to help guide the base into place. These granite needles, covered in hieroglyphs proclaiming the pharaoh's titles and devotion, were pure distillations of Egyptian theology, a fusion of solar worship and kingly power, carved into the hardest stone on earth. Even in the great limestone pyramids of the Old Kingdom, granite was used for the most critical and sacred components. The builders of the Great Pyramid of Khufu chose to construct the king's burial chamber, the very heart of the monument, not from the local limestone but from massive, precisely cut blocks of red granite brought all the way from Aswan. This king's chamber was, in essence, a granite box, an indestructible sanctum designed to protect the pharaoh's sarcophagus for all time. Above it they built a series of 5 stress-relieving chambers, roofed with enormous granite beams, a sophisticated engineering solution to distribute the crushing weight of the pyramid above. The sarcophagus itself, the final container for the royal body, was also carved from a single solid block of granite. To further secure these tombs, the architects designed elaborate security systems using massive granite portcullis blocks, some weighing over 50 tons, which were designed to slide down and permanently seal the passages, blocking the path to would-be tomb robbers. In the temples of the New Kingdom, granite was used for doorways and thresholds, the liminal spaces between different parts of the sacred structure. It was also a favored material for royal and divine statuary, its hardness ensuring the survival of the king's image, and its crystalline texture giving the statues a sense of otherworldly power and vitality. The final stage in creating a granite masterpiece was the polishing. After the rough shape had been battered into existence with dolerite pounders, the surface was still coarse and uneven. To achieve the smooth, often mirror-like finish seen on sarcophagi and statues, the craftsmen began a long and laborious process of grinding and abrasion. They would use rubbing stones of various grits, perhaps sandstone or quartzite, along with an abrasive slurry of fine quartz sand mixed with water. For countless hours, days and weeks, teams of polishers would rub the surface of the granite, their movements slowly smoothing away the rough texture left by the pounders. This process required immense skill and feel, as they had to create perfectly flat planes and smooth flowing curves. The final polishing stages would have used even finer abrasives, perhaps a fine silt powder, to bring the stone to a high gloss. This final polish was transformative. It brought out the deep, rich color of the granite and made the individual crystals of feldspar, quartz and mica sparkle in the light. It turned a dull, heavy rock into a vibrant, shimmering surface that seemed almost alive. This final lustrous sheen was the culmination of the entire process, the last touch of human effort that turned a piece of the earth's bones into a timeless work of art, polished to perfection and ready for eternity. The monumental stoneworks of Egypt were not the product of slave labor, as is often depicted in popular culture. The image of thousands of miserable slaves being whipped by cruel overseers is a myth derived from biblical narratives and Hollywood films. The reality, as revealed by archaeological evidence, including the workers' village and tombs found at Giza, is far more complex and impressive. The quarrymen and construction workers were, for the most part, free Egyptians, a corps of highly skilled permanent workers, architects, master craftsmen and overseers was employed by the state year-round. However, the vast muscle power required for quarrying and hauling was supplied by a rotating levy of peasant farmers. During the annual Nile inundation, when their fields were underwater and could not be worked, tens of thousands of farmers would be conscripted for national service. This was a form of taxation, paying their due to the state through their labor. They were organized into large crews or files, which were further divided into smaller gangs. These gangs often had competitive and boisterous names, such as the Drunkards of Menkora or the Friends of Khufu. They were not slaves. They were a well-organized, fed and housed workforce, a temporary army of builders mobilized for a national project, united by a shared cultural and religious purpose. The choice of stone, its scale, and its placement in the landscape were deeply ideological decisions, designed to communicate and reinforce the core tenets of Egyptian society. The state's ability to command the landscape, to move mountains of limestone, sandstone, and granite from one end of the country to the other, was a constant, visible demonstration of the pharaoh's absolute power. The monuments themselves were propaganda in its purest form. The gleaming white pyramids of the Old Kingdom connected the king to the celestial realm of the sun god, making his divinity manifest. The sprawling sandstone temples of the New Kingdom were economic and political engines. their massive walls covered in scenes of the pharaoh's military victories and his intimate relationship with the gods, reminding all who saw them of the king's role as the sole intermediary between the human and divine. The use of indestructible granite for sarcophagi and obelisks reinforced the central concept of eternity, assuring the people that the king, and by extension the state itself, was eternal and unchanging. These stone structures made the political and religious order seem as natural, permanent and unassailable as the mountains from which they were hewn. They were power, written in a language of stone across the face of Egypt. Today, what remains of ancient Egypt is, overwhelmingly, its stone legacy. The mudbrick cities and palaces where millions of people lived and died have long since dissolved back into the soil from which they were made. The great papyrus libraries have largely crumbled to dust, save for the few scrolls preserved by the desert's miraculous aridity. But the temples and tombs, the houses of the gods and the houses of eternity, remain. They are ruins, to be sure. The fine Torah limestone casing of the pyramids was stripped away centuries ago to build the city of Cairo. The roofs of the great temples have collapsed, and many of their vibrant colors have faded under the relentless sun. Yet their stone skeletons endure. They have survived earthquakes, invasions, the rise and fall of countless empires, and the endless march of the desert sands. They are so massive, so solid, that they resist time itself. Our modern perception of ancient Egypt is therefore profoundly shaped by this selective survival. We see a civilization obsessed with death and the gods, because it was their stone monuments to death and the gods that proved to be immortal. The bones of the earth have outlasted everything else, providing a skewed but undeniably powerful vision of this ancient world. In the final analysis, the story of stone in ancient Egypt is about far more than quarrying techniques and building materials. It is the story of a civilization's relationship with deep time. The Egyptians understood the ephemeral nature of human life, the fragility of the political order, and the certainty of decay. In the face of this, they chose to align themselves with the most permanent, unchanging things they could find, the geology of their land and the predictable cycles of the cosmos. Stone was the medium through which they could transcend their own mortality. By carving their likenesses into granite and building their tombs as artificial mountains, they sought to embed themselves into the very fabric of the planet, to become part of a timeline that stretched not for decades or centuries, but for millions of years. Every pyramid, every temple, every obelisk was a defiance of entropy, an assertion that human endeavor, when tied to a powerful belief system, could create something that would last forever. They are not merely ancient buildings. They are a conversation between a remarkable people and the concept of eternity itself, a message of enduring presence, carved with unimaginable effort into the bones of the earth. We have walked through the quarries that yielded the bones of the earth, and explored the desolate valleys that provided the salt of eternity. We have seen how the Egyptians built their world for the gods and for the ages. But now we must turn our attention away from the colossal and the monumental to something far more delicate, yet no less essential. We now look at the very fabric of their society, the threads that bound their civilization together, from the humble farmer to the divine pharaoh. Our journey takes us to the fertile fields nourished by the Nile's black silt, to witness the cultivation of a simple plant with a delicate blue flower, Linnaeus atassimum, better known to the world as flax. From this single plant, the Egyptians created linen, a textile that was not merely a commodity, but a cornerstone of their existence. It was their clothing, their currency, their sails, and their shrouds. In a land of stone and sun, linen was the textile of choice, prized for its coolness, its strength, and above all, its radiant purity. The story of linen is the story of an intricate process, a journey from seed to thread to cloth that involved immense skill and labor. It is a story that touches every aspect of life and death, weaving together the worlds of agriculture, technology, social status, and the sacred. It is the soft counterpoint to the unyielding stone, a fragile thread that proved to be just as vital in Egypt's quest for an ordered and eternal life. The cultivation of flax was one of the oldest agricultural practices in Egypt, predating the first pharaohs. The plant found its perfect home in the temperate climate and rich alluvial soil left behind by the annual inundation of the Nile. As the floodwaters receded each year, leaving behind a fresh, nutrient-rich layer of black silt, farmers would get to work preparing the land. Unlike grain crops, which were the backbone of the Egyptian diet, flax was not grown for sustenance but for its valuable fibers. Its cultivation required careful attention. The fields were ploughed with simple wooden adze, often drawn by oxen, and the seeds were cast by hand. Tomb paintings from across the dynastic period vividly depict these agricultural scenes, showing farmers striding across the fields, scattering seed from baskets held in their arms. The timing was crucial. Flax was typically sown in the cooler months from October to November, and it grew quickly, requiring about 100 days to reach maturity. During this time, the farmers would have carefully managed irrigation, ensuring the growing plants received enough water but were not waterlogged. The sight of a field of flax in full bloom, a rippling carpet of bright blue flowers under the Egyptian sun, must have been a stunning addition to the agricultural landscape, a vibrant patch of sky brought down to earth. This was the first stage in a long and complex supply chain that would ultimately produce one of Egypt's most important industrial and cultural products. The harvest of the flax was a period of intense coordinated labor, and it differed significantly from the grain harvest. While wheat and barley were cut with sickles, flax was not. To obtain the longest and most valuable fibers, the entire plant had to be pulled up from the ground by the roots. This ensured that no part of the stalk's precious length was lost. Again, we turn to the detailed reliefs in the tombs of the elite, which serve as ancient documentaries of this process. They show teams of laborers, both men and women, working their way across the fields. They would grasp a handful of the tall, slender stalks and pull them forcefully from the earth, shaking the soil from the roots before laying them down in neat bundles. It was stooping, back-breaking work. The timing of the harvest was a matter of professional judgment, as it determined the quality of the final product. If the plant was harvested early, while the stalks were still young and yellow, it would yield extremely fine and soft fibers, suitable for the most luxurious, almost transparent linen. If it was left to mature until the seed capsules turned brown, the fibers would be stronger and coarser, ideal for making ropes, mats, or durable, everyday cloth. Once pulled, the flax stalks were tied into sheaves and carried from the fields on the backs of workers or donkeys, destined for the workshops where their remarkable transformation from plant to textile would begin. With the flax harvested and removed from the fields, the first stage of processing began, a step known as rippling. The goal was to separate the valuable seed capsules from the stalks. The seeds themselves were a crucial secondary product, rich in oil that could be used for cooking, as a base for cosmetics and perfumes, or as a nutritional supplement. To remove them, workers would draw the heads of the flax stalks through a large, heavy wooden comb, which looked like a giant fork with long teeth, firmly planted in the ground. The forceful pulling action would strip the seed capsules away, which were then collected and pressed for their oil. Once de-seeded, the flax stalks faced their most critical and transformative process, retting. Retting is, in essence, controlled decomposition. The valuable linen fibers are located in the outer part of the stalk, the bast, and they are glued to the central woody core by a natural cement called pectin. Retting uses microorganisms, primarily bacteria, to break down this pectin without damaging the linen fibers themselves. The Egyptians employed two main methods. Water retting involved tying the flax stalks into large bundles and submerging them in stagnant pools of water or slow-moving canals for a period of 1 to 2 weeks. The bacteria in the water would go to work, and the process was complete when the fibers could be easily separated from the core. The alternative, dew retting, involved spreading the stalks out in a field and allowing the moisture from the morning dew and the ambient bacteria to do the same job over a longer period. Both methods were effective, but they produced a considerable stench of decay, a pungent but necessary aroma in the production of pure linen. After retting, the flax stalks were thoroughly dried in the sun, which halted the bacterial action. They were now brittle and ready for the next, more violent stage, breaking and scutching. The goal here was to shatter the woody inner core of the stalk, the part known as the chives, and to scrape it away from the raw fibers. Workers would first break the stalks by pounding them with heavy wooden mallets on a stone block. This shattered the brittle core into small pieces, while leaving the flexible bast fibers intact. Then came scutching, a process of scraping. A worker would take a bundle of the broken stalks, and holding them firmly, would strike them with a long blade-like wooden tool. This downward scraping motion would knock away the unwanted woody fragments, gradually revealing the raw, stringy mass of linen fibers that lay within. It was a dusty, noisy, and physically demanding job that required considerable strength and skill to perform without damaging the precious fibers. The result of this process was a tangled bundle of raw fiber, still containing a mixture of long, desirable strands and shorter, coarser pieces. The final purification and sorting step was known as heckling. The scutched flax was pulled through a series of increasingly fine combs or heckles. The first comb with coarse, widely spaced teeth would remove any remaining large pieces of shiv and begin to align the fibers. Subsequent heckles, with sharper and more closely set teeth, would continue to clean and align the fibers, while also separating them by quality. The long, smooth and lustrous fibers, known as line, were set aside for the finest textiles. The shorter, more tangled fibers, the tar, were collected for spinning into coarser thread for everyday cloth, ropes or nets. At the end of this long and laborious process of extraction, what was once a field of tall green plants had been transformed into clouds of soft, lustrous fiber, ready for the spinner's art. The color of this raw fiber ranged from a pale, silvery gray to a creamy, buttery yellow, depending on the specific retting process and the quality of the flax. This raw material represented a significant investment of time and labor, and its value was well understood. Now, the magic of creating thread from this formless mass could begin. In ancient Egypt, spinning was a task performed almost exclusively by women, and they achieved a level of skill that remains astonishing to this day. The primary tool was the drop spindle, a simple but highly effective device consisting of a straight stick with a weighted whorl at one end. The spinner would draw out a few fibers from her prepared bundle of flax, known as a distaff, and twist them together to start the thread. She would then attach this to the spindle, give the spindle a sharp twist, and let it drop, allowing its rotation and weight to spin the fibers into a continuous strong thread. The spinner's skill lay in her ability to control the draw, feeding just the right amount of fiber from the distaff to the twisting spindle to create a thread of perfectly uniform thickness. Egyptian spinners were masters of this art, capable of producing thread so fine and consistent that it rivals modern machine-spun thread. Archaeological finds have revealed linen textiles with thread counts of over 200 threads per inch, a testament to the incredible dexterity and patience of these anonymous female artisans. Once a sufficient quantity of thread had been spun and collected onto bobbins, it was ready for the loom. The creation of cloth from thread is another process vividly illustrated in Egyptian art, particularly in models from Middle Kingdom tombs that depict entire weaving workshops. The earliest and most common type of loom used in Egypt was a horizontal ground loom. This simple but effective apparatus consisted of two wooden beams, staked firmly into the ground, between which the longitudinal threads, known as the warp, were stretched. Setting up the warp was one of the most tedious and critical parts of the process. Hundreds of threads had to be arranged, each one perfectly tensioned and spaced, to form the foundation of the cloth. The length of the warp threads determined the length of the finished bolt of linen, which could be many yards long. In the New Kingdom, a new technology arrived, likely from Western Asia, the vertical loom. In this design, the warp threads were hung from an overhead beam, with weights attached to their bottom ends to create tension. This new loom allowed for the weaving of wider fabrics, and was arguably more ergonomic for the weaver, who could now stand or sit upright while working. Regardless of the loom type, the fundamental principle of weaving remained the same, a rhythmic and intricate dance of threads that transformed the abstract into the tangible. With the warp threads stretched and ready, the weaver could begin their work. The process of weaving involves interlacing a second set of threads, the weft, at a right angle to the warp. To do this, the weaver needed to create a space for the weft thread to pass through. This was achieved with a device called a heddle rod. In its simplest form, this was a stick that was attached to every other warp thread. By lifting the heddle rod, the weaver would raise half of the warp threads, creating a gap or a shed. A shuttle, a bobbin containing the weft thread, was then passed through this shed. Next, the heddle rod was lowered, and the warp threads would return to their original position, locking the weft thread in place. A second shed was then created by lifting the other set of warp threads, and the shuttle was passed back in the opposite direction. To ensure a tight and even fabric, the weaver would use a beater, which could be a flat, sword-like piece of wood or a comb-like tool, to push each new weft thread firmly against the previous one. This rhythmic process of lifting the warp, passing the weft, and beating it into place, repeated thousands of times, slowly built up the cloth, line by line. It was skilled labor, often performed by women working in pairs on the wide ground looms, their hands moving with a practiced and efficient grace. The final product of all this effort was a bolt of pure, unadorned linen cloth. The quality could vary immensely, reflecting its intended use and the status of its owner. The vast majority of linen produced was a sturdy, practical cloth, used for the everyday garments of the common people, for sacks to hold grain, or for the tough sails of Nile riverboats. This cloth was durable and functional, designed to withstand hard use. At the other end of the spectrum was the legendary royal linen, sometimes referred to by the Greek term byssus. This fabric was of an almost supernatural fineness and translucency. It was woven from the finest thread, spun from the youngest flax, and was so sheer that it was almost transparent, delicately veiling the body of the wearer rather than concealing it. Such cloth was incredibly expensive and labor-intensive to produce, reserved for the highest echelons of society, pharaohs, queens, and high priests, and for dressing the statues of the gods themselves. Between these two extremes lay a wide range of linen qualities. The fabric was naturally a creamy white or grey, and while the Egyptians were masters of dyeing, the overwhelming preference for linen was for its natural purity. Often the cloth would be further bleached by washing it and laying it out under the intense sun, a process that enhanced its whiteness, a colour that was deeply symbolic of cleanliness and sacredness. In the hot, dry climate of Egypt, linen was the ideal fabric for clothing, and it was worn by all levels of society. Its fibrous structure allows it to absorb moisture and quickly dry, creating a cooling effect on the skin. For the vast majority of the population, clothing was simple and practical. A working man, such as a farmer or a labourer, would typically wear a simple kilt or loincloth, known as a shendi. This was a wraparound skirt, made from a rectangular piece of sturdy linen, that offered freedom of movement while providing a basic covering. Women of the working class wore simple, straight-fitting sheath dresses, held up by one or two straps over the shoulders. These garments were functional and durable, designed for a life of physical labor. For the elite, however, clothing was a far more elaborate affair, and a primary indicator of their social status. While the basic forms of the kilt and dress remained, the quality of the linen used was vastly superior. A high official would wear a kilt made from the finest, pleated linen, often with a complex arrangement of sashes and overlays. The art of pleating was highly developed. Some surviving garments show incredibly fine, permanent pleats, the method of which is still debated by scholars. These delicate, pleated garments would have required constant maintenance and a team of specialized launderers, themselves a status symbol. As Egyptian fashion evolved, particularly during the wealth and cosmopolitanism of the New Kingdom, garments became more complex and voluminous. Both elite men and women began to wear long, flowing robes made from vast quantities of the finest, sheerest linen. These robes were often intricately pleated, creating a shimmering, layered effect that would have been breathtakingly beautiful in motion. These were not the clothes of a person who engaged in any form of manual labor. They were a conspicuous display of wealth and leisure. The sheer amount of high-quality linen required for a single one of these outfits represented a significant economic investment. Furthermore, maintaining these garments was a major undertaking. Ancient laundry lists and scenes from tombs depict the work of launderers or fullers, who would wash the linen in the Nile or in special basins, often using natron as a cleansing agent, before beating the cloth on flat stones and leaving it to bleach in the sun. To be able to afford not only the fine linen itself but also the staff required to keep it pristine and perfectly pleated was the ultimate statement of high social standing. In this way, the simple thread of the flax plant became a key visual signifier of the rigid social hierarchy that structured Egyptian society. The utility of linen extended far beyond clothing, permeating every aspect of domestic and industrial life. In the home, it was used for bedding, providing cool and comfortable sheets and mattress covers. It served as towels, tablecloths, and simple curtains. Stronger, coarser linen was made into sacks and bags for storing and transporting grain and other goods, a fundamental part of the agricultural economy. Perhaps one of its most critical industrial applications was in the creation of sailcloth. Egypt was a riverine civilization, and the Nile was its highway. Trade, communication, and the movement of armies and building materials all depended on river transport. The iconic Egyptian riverboats, with their tall, square sails, were powered by the wind captured in massive sheets of heavy-duty linen. The strength and durability of the fabric were essential to withstand the force of the wind. Similarly, the tow fibers, the shorter byproduct of flax processing, were not wasted. They were twisted into strong ropes and cords used for everything from tethering animals to rigging ships and, most importantly, for the vast hauling operations required to move quarried stone blocks. The ubiquitous nets used by Egyptian fishermen and fowlers, so often depicted in tomb paintings, were also meticulously crafted from linen twine, providing a vital source of protein for the population. Every part of the flax plant and its fibers was integrated into the material culture, a testament to the resourcefulness of the Egyptian people, in an economy that for most of its history lacked coinage. Linen played a crucial role as a store of value and a medium of exchange. Alongside grain, it formed a type of proto-currency. The value of goods and services was often calculated in units of linen. Administrative documents, such as the records from the village of Deir el-Medina, the community of artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, meticulously list payments to the workers. These payments were not in money, but in a basket of goods that included bread, beer, fish, vegetables, and, significantly, bolts of linen cloth. A worker might receive a new kilt or a length of cloth as part of his monthly wages. This cloth could then be used by his family or traded in the local market for other necessities. Legal documents, such as marriage settlements and inheritance texts, also list linen garments and textiles as valuable, transferable property. For a transaction to work this way, there had to be a shared understanding of the value of different qualities of linen. A bolt of royal linen was worth vastly more than a bolt of coarse sailcloth. This system turned linen into one of the foundational commodities of the Egyptian economy, a tangible and universally accepted form of wealth that was produced, taxed, stored, and exchanged, lubricating the gears of commerce long before the first silver coin appeared in Egypt. The importance of linen, however, transcended its practical and economic roles and entered the sacred realm. Its natural, unadorned whiteness was a powerful symbol of light, life, and, above all, purity. In a religious system that placed enormous emphasis on ritual cleanliness, linen was the only acceptable material for sacred purposes. Wool, which came from a living animal, was considered ritually impure and was forbidden within the sacred precincts of a temple. Priests, who had to be in a constant state of ritual purity to serve the gods, were required to shave their bodies and dress only in garments of the finest, cleanest white linen. When a priest entered the temple, clad in his pure linen kilt and shawl, he left the mundane, impure world behind and entered the sacred space of the gods. The texts describe in detail the stringent purification rituals for priests, which included frequent washing and the exclusive use of linen. This prescription extended to all sacred acts. Any individual making an offering or participating in a religious festival would strive to wear clean linen as a sign of respect and piety. The fabric itself became synonymous with the concept of holiness, the required uniform for any interaction between humanity and the divine. This sacred role was projected onto the gods themselves. The Egyptians believed that the cult statues housed in the dark inner sanctums of their temples were the literal dwelling places of the gods on earth. These statues were not inert idols. They were living embodiments of the divine, with daily needs that had to be met by the temple clergy. The most important of these daily rituals, performed every morning in every temple across Egypt, was the opening of the mouth ceremony, which awakened the god and was followed by cleansing and dressing the statue. The high priest would gently wash the divine image and then clothe it in fresh garments made from the highest quality royal linen. These divine garments were often incredibly elaborate and were stored in special temple treasuries. The act of weaving for the gods was itself a sacred duty, often undertaken by high-status women in dedicated temple workshops. By clothing the gods in the purest substance they could manufacture, the Egyptians were honoring them, caring for them, and maintaining the reciprocal relationship that ensured the continued stability and prosperity of the cosmos. Linen was, in this sense, a gift worthy of the gods, a product of human labor offered up to maintain divine favor. Ultimately, the most profound and extensive use of linen was in the context of death and the afterlife. It was the final material to touch the body, the very stuff of resurrection. As we have seen, the process of mummification was designed to preserve the physical form for the soul's return. Once the body had been desiccated with natron for 40 days, it was the task of the embalmers to wrap it in linen, a process that was as much a magical ritual as it was a physical act. The quantity of linen used was astonishing, often amounting to hundreds of square yards for a single mummy. This linen came from various sources. Some of it was specifically woven for the funeral, but much of it was repurposed from old household textiles, sheets, towels, and clothing that had been used by the deceased during their lifetime. These were torn into long, narrow strips forming the bandages. The wrapping process was meticulous and symbolic, a final act of care and protection. The embalmers would wrap each limb, each finger, and each toe separately before enveloping the entire body in multiple layers. Between the layers they would place protective amulets, and a lector priest would recite magical spells, infusing the linen with protective power. The layers of linen served multiple purposes. Physically, they protected the fragile, desiccated body from the elements, and gave it a recognizable human-like form. But the symbolic purpose was far more important. The wrapping was a process of transformation. By encasing the deceased in layers of pure white linen, the embalmers were ritually purifying the body, cleansing it of the taint of death. The mummy, cocooned in its linen shell, was likened to the god Osiris in his shroud. It was a liminal state, a chrysalis from which the deceased would be reborn into the afterlife. The bandages were the sacred swaddling clothes of a new eternal life. Often crucial texts and spells from the Book of the Dead, designed to help the deceased navigate the dangers of the underworld, were written directly onto the linen bandages or on a papyrus scroll that was wrapped within them. The very last layer was a large linen shroud, which was often secured with wider bandages. This final immaculate white covering represented the successful transfiguration of the deceased into an Ak, a blessed and effective spirit. Thus the journey that began with a seed in the Nile mud found its ultimate fulfillment in the darkness of the tomb, where the threads of an earthly plant became the key to an unearthly eternity. The production of linen was a cornerstone of the Egyptian state economy, a vast industry managed and taxed by the pharaoh's administration. While much production happened at a local or household level, the state and the great temple complexes operated massive workshops, known as harem in the Old Kingdom, which employed thousands of workers. These state-controlled manufactories produced the enormous quantities of linen needed for the army, for temple rituals, and for the lavish funerary equipment of the royal family and the elite. Flax cultivation was a key part of the agricultural tax base, with government scribes carefully recording the yield of the fields and levying a portion for the state granaries and workshops. The finished cloth was also a major export commodity. Fine Egyptian linen was highly prized throughout the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, a luxury good that brought considerable wealth into the country. It was traded for cedarwood from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. This trade further enhanced the prestige of Egypt as a center of sophisticated craftsmanship. For thousands of years, Egypt held a near monopoly on high-quality linen production, making it a form of soft power and a vital engine of its international commerce. The absolute dominance of linen in Egypt began to face challenges in the later periods of its history, particularly after its conquest by Alexander the Great and its incorporation into the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. While linen never disappeared and continued to be a major product, new fibers and textiles began to appear, brought in by the new rulers and changing trade patterns. Wool, while always known to the Egyptians, had been considered impure and was largely associated with foreign peoples like the Libyans and Syrians. Under Greek and Roman influence, this cultural taboo weakened, and the use of wool for warmer clothing became more common. The Romans also introduced and expanded the cultivation of cotton in Egypt, a fiber that was easier to process and dye than linen. These new textiles offered different qualities of warmth, texture, and color that appealed to the cosmopolitan tastes of the era. The ancient, labor-intensive methods of flax processing and weaving also began to be supplanted by more advanced technologies, such as the improved vertical looms of the Roman period. While the production of linen for religious purposes and traditional mummy wrappings continued well into the Roman era, its ubiquity in daily life slowly began to decline as it competed with these new alternatives. In the grand tapestry of ancient Egyptian civilization, linen forms the essential binding warp through which all other threads are woven. It is a story of profound transformation, of turning a simple plant into a symbol of purity, a tool of the economy, and a vehicle for eternal life. Its production demonstrates an intimate understanding of natural processes and a mastery of craft passed down through generations. From the farmer pulling flax from the rich Nile mud, to the women spinning thread so fine it seems weightless, to the priest clothing a god in a veil of pure white, the story of linen is the story of the Egyptian people. It clothed the bodies of the living and protected the bodies of the dead. It was the sail that caught the wind and the rope that moved mountains of stone. It was a measure of wealth and a marker of holiness. While the stone monuments speak of a civilization's power and its ambition for permanence, the fragile, surviving threads of linen tell a more intimate story. They speak of the daily lives, the social structures, and the deepest spiritual beliefs of a people who understood that the most powerful things in the universe were not always the hardest or the most grand, but could also be as soft, as pure, and as essential as a single white thread. For our final journey, we return to the source of all life in Egypt, the Nile. But we are not looking at the water itself, nor the plants that grow beside it. We are looking at what it leaves behind. Every year for millennia, the great river would swell and overflow its banks, depositing a gift of incalculable value. This was not gold or precious gems, but a rich, dark, fertile layer of silt, the black earth that gave Egypt its ancient name, Kemet. From this sacred mud the Egyptians grew their food, but they also raised their world, for this black earth, when mixed with water and dried by the sun, became the single most important building material in their civilization. This is the story of the humble mudbrick. While stone was reserved for the gods and the dead, for the eternal houses of the temple and the tomb, it was the simple, sun-baked brick that built the houses of the living. It built the bustling cities, the sprawling palaces of the pharaohs, the mighty fortresses that guarded the frontiers, and the workshops where artisans crafted their wonders. To understand mudbrick is to understand the 99% of ancient Egypt that has largely vanished, the ephemeral, vibrant, and teeming world of life that existed in the shadow of the eternal stone. It is the story of the flesh of the land, as opposed to its bones. The genius of mudbrick lies in its profound simplicity and its perfect harmony with the Egyptian environment. The raw materials were not mined from treacherous shafts or quarried from distant cliffs. They were available in limitless quantities right underfoot. The primary ingredient was the Nile silt itself, a fine-grained mixture of clay and sand carried down from the Ethiopian highlands. This alluvial mud was wonderfully plastic when wet, allowing it to be molded with ease, and it dried to a dense, hard state. However, pure mud, when dried quickly under the intense Egyptian sun, has a tendency to shrink and crack. To counteract this, the brickmakers added a temper, a binding agent that provided internal strength and ensured a more uniform drying process. The most common and effective temper was straw. Chopped straw or chaff, a waste product from the grain harvest, was mixed into the wet mud. The fibers of the straw acted as a natural reinforcement, much like modern rebar in concrete, distributing the stress of drying and preventing the formation of large cracks. It also made the finished brick lighter and gave it better thermal properties. In areas where straw was less abundant, Other tempers could be used, such as sand, small pebbles, or even animal dung, which also contained fibrous organic material. The second key ingredient was water, used to turn the dry soil into a thick, malleable paste. And the final crucial component was the sun itself, the divine fire of Ra, which provided the energy to bake the bricks without the need for fuel-hungry kilns, making the entire process remarkably sustainable and energy efficient. The newly formed bricks were left to bake in the sun for several days, or even weeks, depending on the season and the intensity of the heat. During this time, the sun's energy would evaporate the water, and the mud would slowly harden into a durable, stone-like block. The workers would often turn the bricks onto their sides after a few days to ensure they dried evenly on all surfaces. Once fully cured, the bricks were ready for use. They were hard, surprisingly lightweight, and had excellent properties for the Egyptian climate. Their natural density and the tiny air pockets created by the straw temper gave them high thermal mass, meaning they would absorb the heat of the sun slowly during the day, keeping the interior of a building cool. Then, at night, they would slowly release this stored heat, providing warmth as the desert air grew cold. The scale of this production was immense. For a major building project like a royal palace or a fortress, millions of bricks would be needed. Sometimes, for official state projects, the bricks would be stamped while still wet with a special seal bearing the cartouche of the reigning pharaoh or the name of the institution, a mark of royal ownership and quality control. This simple, repetitive process, powered by the mud, water and sun, was the true engine of Egyptian construction, a testament to their ability to create boundless resources from the land itself. The identity of the brickmakers is a subject often clouded by myth, particularly the enduring biblical narrative of enslaved Israelites being forced to make bricks without straw. While this story powerfully conveys a message of oppression, the archaeological and historical reality in Egypt was more nuanced. Brickmaking, like most large-scale labor, was organized by the state or by large temple estates. The workforce was composed primarily of native Egyptians, part of the same corvée labor system that quarried stone and dug irrigation canals. During the agricultural off-season, a levy of peasants would be called up to work on these state projects as a form of taxation. They were organized, fed and housed by their employer, whether that was the pharaoh's administration or a local temple. Foreign captives of war and slaves did exist in ancient Egypt, and they were certainly put to work, sometimes on these very building projects, but they did not form the primary labor force. The scene described in Exodus, where the pharaoh's overseers demand the same quota of bricks while withholding the straw, reflects a deep understanding of the brick-making process. Removing the vital straw temper would have made the work significantly harder, and the resulting bricks of much poorer quality, a truly cruel and effective form of punishment. However, the evidence suggests that brick-making was a standard form of labor for the general Egyptian populace, a seasonal duty that built the very fabric of their own civilization. It was in the construction of the Egyptian home that the virtues of mudbrick were most fully realized. From the simple two-room dwelling of a common farmer to the sprawling multi-courtyard villa of a high official, mudbrick was the universal material of domestic architecture. A typical house in a planned workers' village like Deir el-Medina was a long, narrow affair, divided into several rooms. The entrance often led to a main reception area, which might have a low brick bench for seating and a small shrine. Beyond this lay a central living room, its roof supported by a single wooden column, with a staircase leading up to the roof. The rear of the house contained the kitchen, with a clay oven and grinding stones, and sometimes a small cellar for storage. The most important living space, however, was often the flat roof. In the cool evenings, the family would gather on the roof to socialize, eat, and sleep under the stars, a welcome escape from the stored heat of the day. For the wealthy elite, this basic plan was expanded into a luxurious country-style villa. These houses, like the ones excavated at Amarna, were centered around a large open courtyard and surrounded by gardens with trees and pools. They featured multiple reception halls, private bedrooms, bathrooms, and extensive servants' quarters. Yet, despite the difference in scale and luxury, they were built from the same fundamental material as the humble worker's home. The mudbrick walls were laid down in courses, using a simple mortar of wet mud to bond them together. The resulting structures were durable, climatically efficient, and could be constructed quickly and cheaply, providing comfortable shelter for every level of society. The Egyptians became masters of exploiting the structural possibilities of mudbrick, developing techniques that went far beyond simple walls. They were pioneers in the use of arches, vaults, and domes, centuries before the Romans made them famous in stone. Because mudbrick has good compressive strength but poor tensile strength, it cannot be used for long, flat spans like a stone lintel, to roof a large room or a long corridor without using precious and expensive wooden beams. The Egyptians turned to the arch. By arranging the bricks in a curved shape, they could transform the vertical force of the weight above into compressive forces that ran down the curve of the arch and into the supporting walls. They built spectacular barrel vaults, creating long, tunnel-like ceilings entirely out of mudbrick. The granaries behind the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple of Ramesses II, are a stunning example of this technology still standing today. A series of massive vaulted galleries provided vast climate-controlled spaces for storing the grain that was the lifeblood of the temple's economy. They also constructed domes and cross vaults, creating complex and beautiful interior spaces. To protect the raw brick from the elements, and to provide a smooth, clean surface, the interior and exterior walls of the houses were almost always covered in a layer of mud plaster, which was then whitewashed with a solution of gypsum. This gave the villagers their characteristic clean, white appearance. In the homes of the wealthy, this plaster became a canvas for vibrant and lively art, with walls and floors painted with scenes from nature, geometric patterns, and images of feasting and family life. While temples and tombs were built of stone to last for eternity, the great palaces of the living pharaohs were constructed almost entirely of mudbrick. This was a deliberate and deeply symbolic choice. A palace was the personal residence and administrative center of a specific king. It was part of his mortal, earthly existence. While the king himself possessed a divine nature, his palace was not a house of a god in the same way a temple was. It was the setting for the temporal, ever-changing pageant of courtly life. Consequently, these sprawling complexes were designed to be magnificent but ephemeral. The most famous examples, such as the Palace of Amenhotep III at Malkata on the west bank of Thebes, were veritable cities of mudbrick. Malkata was a labyrinthine complex of audience halls, throne rooms, private apartments for the king and his extensive harem, administrative offices, kitchens, workshops, and a vast ceremonial lake. It was a bustling center of power, but it was not designed to outlast the reign of its builder. The mudbrick walls were covered in dazzling decoration. Floors were painted to look like pools of water teeming with fish and fowl. Ceilings were covered in stars and flying vultures. Walls were adorned with vibrant frescoes of foreign captives, courtly life, and natural scenes. This was a world of color, light, and life, a stark contrast to the somber, eternal stone of the nearby temples. When the king died, the palace was often abandoned. Its functions moved to the palace of his successor. The mudbrick would slowly begin to decay, its painted plaster flaking away, until it eventually melted back into the desert landscape, a planned obsolescence that respected the division between the temporary world of the living and the eternal world of the gods. Another critical, and often overlooked use of mudbrick was in the defense of the nation. It was the primary material for the construction of Egypt's formidable military fortifications. From the Old Kingdom onwards, the pharaohs built walls and fortresses to protect their towns, their trade routes, and their borders from foreign incursions. The most impressive of these were the chain of massive fortresses built by the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom along the Nile in Lower Nubia, a region that was a constant source of threat and a vital source of gold. Forts like the one at Buhan are masterpieces of military engineering, and they were built almost entirely of mudbrick. The walls of Buhan were immense, up to 5 meters thick and 10 meters high, and were built with a distinctive wavy construction style, with alternating concave and convex sections, which may have helped the structure resist subsidence and seismic shocks. The main wall was surrounded by a deep, dry moat, a lower outer rampart with projecting, square bastions, and a narrow covered fighting corridor lined with loopholes for archers. The design was complex and layered, creating multiple overlapping fields of fire that would have made it a nightmare for any attacking force. The choice of mudbrick for these forts was not a compromise, it was a strategic advantage. The thick earthen walls were incredibly effective at absorbing the impact of projectiles and the force of battering rams, far better than more brittle stone which could shatter. These Nubian forts demonstrate the incredible versatility of mudbrick, showing it not just as a material for domestic life, but as a key component of the state's military power. The result of this widespread use of mudbrick was the creation of some of the world's first true urban landscapes. While the stone monuments on the desert edge give the impression of a civilization of scattered temples, the reality on the floodplain was a network of dense, thriving cities, towns, and villages. Some of these, like the workers' village of Kahan, or Akhenaten's new capital at Akhetaten, Amarna, were laid out on a rigid grid plan, with straight streets and uniform housing blocks, a clear sign of state-controlled urban planning. These sites provide an unparalleled snapshot of Egyptian society, revealing the layout of neighborhoods and the relationships between public, private, and industrial spaces. At Amarna, the city was divided into distinct zones. The central city contained the great temples and palaces, while the northern and southern suburbs housed the nobles in their sprawling villas and the artisans in their more modest homes. Other older cities like Memphis or Thebes were more organic, growing over centuries into a chaotic but vibrant tangle of streets, alleys, markets, and residential quarters. The vast majority of these urban landscapes, from the grandest palace to the humblest workshop, was built from sun-dried mudbrick. They were noisy, crowded, and lively places, the true heart of Egyptian civilization. These were the settings for the daily drama of life, a world that has been almost entirely lost to us because of the very nature of the material from which it was built. Even in the realm of the dead, where stone was the material of choice for the elite, mudbrick played a crucial supporting role. The very first royal tombs of the earliest dynasties at Abydos were subterranean chambers covered by large, solid, rectangular superstructures called mastabas, and these were built of mudbrick. These early mastabas were often decorated with complex palace facade niching, a style of recessed paneling that imitated the great walls of the royal palaces, a direct translation of the architecture of the living into the architecture of the dead. As stone became the preferred material for the king's tomb, mudbrick continued to be used for the tombs of the non-royal elite and for subsidiary structures. The great pyramid complexes at Giza were surrounded by vast enclosure walls, often kilometers long and many meters thick, and these were always constructed of mudbrick. These walls served to demarcate the sacred precinct, separating the ordered world of the necropolis from the chaos of the desert beyond. Furthermore, the core of several of the pyramids of the Middle Kingdom, such as those of Senusret II and Amenemhat III, were not built of solid stone but of mudbrick. The builders would create a framework of stone retaining walls and then fill the interior with millions of mudbricks before casing the entire structure in fine limestone. This was a cheaper and much faster method of construction, but tragically, it was far less permanent. Once the limestone casing was stripped away by later stone robbers, the exposed mudbrick core was vulnerable to the elements and quickly eroded, leaving the shapeless, mound-like structures we see today. The use of mud had a deep and resonant symbolic meaning that was rooted in Egyptian creation myths. The very act of forming a brick from wet mud echoed the work of the creator gods. One of the most important creator deities, particularly in the region of southern Egypt, was the ram-headed god Kun. It was said that Kun, the divine potter, fashioned the bodies of humans and the gods themselves from clay on his potter's wheel, and then breathed life into them. The goddess Hathor would then present the newly created being with the Ankh, the symbol of life. Therefore, the Nile mud was not just an inert substance. It was the very stuff of creation, the primal matter from which life emerged. The annual flooding of the Nile, which deposited this life-giving silt, was a reenactment of the original creation of the world. When the first primordial mound, the Benben, rose from the chaotic waters of Nun, the blackness of the mud was also profoundly symbolic. To the Egyptian mind, black was not a color of evil or mourning, but of fertility, life, and resurrection. It was the color of the rich soil of the Nile Valley, the source of all prosperity, and it was the color of the underworld through which the deceased was reborn. Just as the god Osiris, often depicted with black or green skin, was the god of resurrection, Building a house from the black earth was therefore an act imbued with positive symbolism, creating a home from the very substance of life and rebirth. However, the great strength of mudbrick, its cheapness, its ubiquity, and its organic nature was also its greatest weakness, its vulnerability. Unlike stone, mudbrick is not a permanent material. Its chief enemy is water. A single, unusually high flood or a rare torrential downpour could cause catastrophic damage to a mudbrick structure, weakening the foundations and turning the lower courses of the walls back into a sludgy paste. This is one of the primary reasons why Egyptian cities built on the active floodplain had to be constantly repaired and rebuilt. The other enemy was wind and abrasion. Over time, the wind-blown sand of the desert would slowly scour away the surface of the bricks, and the plaster would need to be constantly renewed to protect the underlying structure. A mud brick house required constant maintenance. This cycle of decay and renewal was simply part of the rhythm of life. When a building fell into disuse and was no longer maintained, it would slowly but surely disintegrate. The walls would crumble, the roof would collapse, and the structure would eventually slump into a low, shapeless mound, its bricks slowly dissolving back into the earth from which they came. Over generations, as new houses were built on top of the ruins of old ones, the cities of Egypt rose in height, creating artificial mounds known as tels, which are common throughout the Near East. This inherent impermanence is the main reason why our modern perception of ancient Egypt is so heavily skewed towards its stone monuments. The temples and tombs, built from granite, sandstone and limestone on the high, dry desert edge, were designed to be separate from the world of the living and to last for eternity. They have, for the most part, fulfilled that purpose. The cities and palaces, built from mud brick on the low-lying, fertile floodplain, were the heart of the civilization, but they have almost entirely vanished. Many were washed away by the changing course of the Nile over the centuries. Others were buried under layers of their own debris in the continuous occupation of later towns and cities. A more recent threat has been the practice of using the soil from these ancient mounds known as sebak as a natural fertilizer. For centuries, farmers have dug into the ruins of ancient cities to quarry the nitrogen-rich soil from the decayed mud brick and organic waste, inadvertently destroying priceless archaeological evidence. The result is that the world of the living has been erased, while the world of the dead has been preserved. This creates a misleading picture of a civilization obsessed solely with death, when in fact the Egyptians celebrated life with a passion and vibrancy that is clearly visible in the art they left behind. The architecture of that life was simply written in a less permanent medium. The recovery of mudbrick Egypt is a relatively recent archaeological story. For a long time, the early treasure-seeking archaeologists were drawn to the spectacular stone tombs and temples, ignoring the humble, unimpressive mounds of decayed mud brick. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that pioneering archaeologists like Sir Flinders Petrie began to take a systematic interest in these tels, realizing that they held the key to understanding the daily life, social structure, and urbanism of ancient Egypt. Petrie's meticulous excavations at sites like Kahun, the Middle Kingdom town that housed the workers who built the pyramid of Senusret II, were revolutionary. He carefully excavated the houses, uncovering the tools, pottery, and personal belongings of the inhabitants, and was able to reconstruct the town's grid-like layout and social organization. The even more spectacular discoveries at Amarna, Akhenaten's short-lived capital, provided a near-perfectly preserved blueprint of a complete Egyptian city, from the grand palaces and temples to the villas of the nobles and the workshops of the sculptors. These mud brick cities, frozen in time, have provided more information about Egyptian social history, economics, and urban life than any number of monumental stone temples. They have allowed us to repopulate the ancient landscape, to move beyond the pharaohs and priests, and to understand the lives of the ordinary people who were the true foundation of the Egyptian state. In the final accounting of Egypt's great resources, the black earth of the Nile, in the form of the humble mud brick, must stand as one of the most significant. It was the democratic building material, available to all, used by all. It was the substance that shaped the physical world of the living, creating the spaces for domesticity, industry, governance, and defense. It was a material that was perfectly attuned to its environment, a product of a sustainable and elegant technology that harnessed the power of the river and the sun. The story of mudbrick provides a vital counter-narrative to the story of stone. It reminds us that the Egyptians made a clear and conscious distinction between the architecture of the temporary and the architecture of the eternal. Life was vibrant, colourful and ever-changing, and the mudbrick palaces and homes reflected this. The afterlife was unchanging and permanent, and the stone tombs and temples were built to embody that ideal. While gold captures our imagination with its glitter, and stone awes with its scale and permanence, it was the simple, dark mud of the river that truly nurtured and housed this extraordinary civilization. Its value lay not in its rarity, but in its ubiquity, not in its hardness, but in its adaptability. It was the earth itself, raised up by human hands to create a home, a testament to a people who built their world, quite literally, from the ground up. Our journey through the material world of ancient Egypt began with the dazzling allure of gold, the symbol of divine permanence that so often dominates our perception of this ancient land. Yet, as we have seen, the true foundation of this enduring civilization was not built upon that which glitters, but upon the subtle, powerful, and far more essential resources drawn from the land itself. The story of ancient Egypt, when we look beyond the golden masks, is a story of profound ingenuity born from an intimate understanding of the environment. It is a lesson in how a civilization's greatest wealth is not what it hoards, but what it creates from the world around it. The true treasures were not locked away in tombs, but were present in every facet of daily life. We began in the vibrant green marshes, where the slender papyrus reed was transformed into the very mind of the empire. On these light, flexible sheets, the Egyptians built a civilization of knowledge. They managed a sprawling bureaucracy, codified their laws, recorded their histories, and gave voice to their poetry and prayers. Papyrus was the nervous system of the state and the vessel of its culture, a technology that allowed thought itself to be preserved and transmitted across the gulf of millennia. In its delicate woven fibers, we find the threads of their intellect, an empire not of gold, but of organized information. Then we journeyed into the silent, sun-scorched desert, to the crystalline shores of the Wadi el-Natron. Here we found natron, the divine salt, the very substance of purity and transformation. This was the agent that cleansed the temples, purified the priests, and most critically, cheated decay. It was natron that made the Egyptian vision of the afterlife physically possible, arresting the natural course of corruption and preserving the mortal body as an eternal home for the soul. In this harsh, alkaline landscape, the Egyptians found the key to their most deeply held spiritual beliefs, the chemical that allowed them to build a bridge between the world of the living and the eternity of the gods. From there our path led us to the bones of the earth itself, the monumental stones of the Nile Valley. In the soft, pale limestone, the rugged golden sandstone, and the eternal crystalline granite, the Egyptians found the materials to manifest their ambition and their faith. Stone was the medium of permanence, the language of the divine. With it they raised mountains to the heavens and carved temples that were models of the cosmos. The sheer effort of quarrying and moving these colossal weights using little more than muscle, patience and ingenuity remains one of humanity's greatest achievements. Stone gave their civilization its enduring skeleton, a framework of belief and power that has resisted the erosion of time itself. We then shifted our focus to the soft, green fields of flax, whose delicate blue flowers concealed the threads of civilization. From this humble plant, the Egyptians wove their world. Linen was the fabric of their daily lives, the cool cloth that clothed the farmer, and the diaphanous, pleated robes that advertised the status of the noble. It was the sail that powered their commerce, the rope that hauled their monuments, and the currency that paid their workers. And in the end it was the final, pure embrace, the sacred shroud that wrapped the dead, its white folds promising purification and rebirth. Linen was the textile of life, and the passport to the afterlife, a single thread connecting the mundane to the magical. Finally, we return to the black earth, the gift of the Nile's annual flood. From this fertile mud, they created the humble, sun-baked brick that housed the nation. While stone was for the gods, mud brick was for the people. It built the bustling cities, the magnificent palaces, and the mighty fortresses. It was the architecture of the living, ephemeral and organic, designed for the cycles of life, not for the stasis of eternity. In these earthen walls we find the ghost of the vibrant, teeming world of ancient Egypt, a reminder that the great stone monuments were once surrounded by a civilization humming with the rhythms of daily existence. These 5 resources, papyrus, natron, stone, linen, and mudbrick, were the true pillars of the pharaonic world. They represent a sophisticated, holistic understanding of a unique landscape. The Egyptians saw their valley not as a collection of commodities, but as an integrated system, a divine gift to be used with wisdom and reverence. Their genius lay in seeing the potential in the common, in transforming the mud, reeds, and rocks into the very fabric of one of history's most successful and long-lived cultures. Gold was precious, yes, but it was inert. It was a symbol of an end state, of eternity achieved. The true value, the true engine of Egypt, was in these other materials, the ones that allowed life to be lived, a society to be managed, and the sacred to be honored. They were the resources of process, not just of prestige. And perhaps that is their final, whispered lesson to us across the ages, that the enduring strength of any civilization is measured not by the treasures it buries, but by its ability to creatively and sustainably transform the simple gifts of the earth into a thriving and meaningful world for the living.